start this show with the music. Doggone it. And the music's just not starting up. Whoa. Doesn't even start doesn't even start up with with that option. I gotta rethink how I'm doing things. So many dilemmas. I had these intentions of getting up this morning and just diverting myself to detailing in a blog post, what do we mean when we say somebody's got good energy? And I had all these detailed thoughts that I wanted to flesh out, and then Iran has to go ahead and launch its first direct attack on Israel. And so now I want it live streamed. So do I spend my time writing? Do I spend my time live streaming? I spent about 2 hours this morning primarily writing about Iran's attack on Israel, and writing's a great exercise. Writing provides a mirror to your mind. It makes you a more effective speaker. On the other hand, there are a lot of rewards to live streaming, right? You get the immediate feedback. It's much more public, more stimulating in many ways. But on the other hand, what's really going to resonate and vibrate down through history? Will it be my blog posts on good energy, or will it be my live streams on the Iranian versus Israel conflict in the Middle East? So many different ways to look at this topic. One way is, how would any other country react, right, if they were attacked by approximately 500 missiles and drones, right? Do you think the United States would just stand by and not react? So the Biden administration is apparently pleading with Israel not to react, but Israel's air defense systems, combined with apparently pleading with Israel what the United States is doing and other countries are doing. Many of the Sunni nations have more sympathy with Israel than they do with Iran. And so the Biden administration is urging Israel, hey, build on the sympathy that this attack will gain you, and don't fall into some kind of self-destructive tit-for-tat battle with Iran that's really not in your best interest, certainly not in America's best interest, right? America's primary geopolitical enemy is China, and every bit of attention, right, that goes to Ukraine or to Israel or to the Middle East distracts America from its number one geopolitical enemy. And administrations and individuals such as presidents and Joe Biden, all right, Joe Biden's not dealing with that much cognitive processing power to begin with. And so every minute that he has to think about Israel, think about Ukraine, right, he has to think about things that are tangential to America's vital interests. And it's time that he does not get to spend on thinking what is most important. So what was it Stephen Covey says in the 7 Laws of Highly Effective People? Don't confuse the urgent for the important. Don't allow the urgent to crowd out the important. And the Biden administration seems to be repeatedly allowing the urgent, such as Russia's attack on Ukraine, or Hamas's attack on Israel, and then Israel's attack on Gaza, and now Iran's attack on Israel. The Biden administration seems to be repeatedly allowing the urgent to overcrowd, take up energy, space, time, cognitive processing power that would be better devoted to America's vital strategic interests. And what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Ukraine, right, has almost nothing to do with America's vital strategic interests. And yet the Biden administration seems to be completely distracted by what's going on. One thought I have about this conflict is, how would any other nation react in the situation that Israel finds itself in? So if the United States were attacked by 500 missiles and drones, even if none of its citizens were killed, right? Apparently 31 people in Israel were injured. But let's say 31 Americans were injured, but nobody was killed by some drone and missile attack by a foreign nation. How would the United States react? How would England react? How would France or Germany or Holland or Russia or Ukraine or China or Japan or South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, how would these nations react if they were attacked in a similar way? And I can't imagine any other nation not reacting with some direct, explicit, public attack on whoever did this to them, unless it was a very weak country, right? You would think that if the United States did not react viscerally, militarily, publicly to an attack like this, or England or France or Germany, you'd think that these nations were just cocked. You'd think that they had lost the spirit to defend themselves and that there was something wrong with them. So the only country that I could conceive of not reacting viscerally, strongly to an attack like this would be a very weak country. And Israel's not a very weak country, right? Israel has the strongest, most capable military in the Middle East. So on the one hand, I can see strong arguments for Israel not explicitly, publicly retaliating against Iran for this attack, because this Iranian attack seemed much more of an exercise in virtue signaling to its own citizens and to its allies and to the world than in actually trying to do something. So on the one hand, this Iranian attack reminds me of people who drive down the street alone in their car while wearing a face mask, right? On the face of wearing a face mask while you're alone does nothing to reduce your odds of contracting the coronavirus. It doesn't do anything virtuous. But what it does virtue signal. It indicates that you take the coronavirus challenge seriously and that you want to publicly align yourself with what the good people are saying, the public health authorities are saying, what politicians saying, what doctors are saying, that it's meritorious to wear masks to try to reduce the transmission of COVID. And so even though the particular situation of when you're alone and you're wearing a mask, right, there's no reason to believe that this has any practical benefit, you are virtue signaling. And one of the ways that I've changed my mind, one of the ways that I've grown, is that I've come to believe that virtue signaling in many cases is virtuous. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily virtuous in the case of you're wearing a mask while you're driving alone, but I am better able to see the argument for virtue signaling. It was not something that I understood before. But when you see signaling throughout nature, right, maybe signaling among people is virtuous as well, right? Maybe virtue signaling is virtuous, and maybe signaling such as what Iran did with sending these slow-moving drones that are frequently lit up and these slow-moving missiles to Israel, maybe it was virtuous in terms of Iran's interests, right? Maybe it signaled to the United States and to Israel that it was dangerous to mess with Iran. Millions of Israelis took shelter, right? So Iran demonstrated its ability to disrupt the lives of millions of an enemy nation, right? And they signaled that they could do much worse than this. They signaled to its allies in the region and to people around the world that they take seriously Israel's attack on April 1st. So Israel killed a top Iranian general and several other leaders of either Hezbollah or Iran's military by bombing a building that was adjacent to the Iranian embassy in Damascus. So apparently they did not bomb the actual Iranian embassy in Damascus, as many news reports indicated. They bombed a building adjacent to the embassy that was used for Iranian arming of its proxies, such as Hezbollah. And even if they did bomb the embassy itself, while a violation of international law, an embassy is not sovereign, all right? So the Iranian embassy is not, according to international law, counted as the same as Iranian territory, right? Not sovereign. It's different than attacking Iran proper. So Iran did attack Israel proper. So there is a gradational difference here. Israel did not attack Iran proper when it went after the building next to its embassy in Damascus. Now Iran has attacked Israel proper. But getting back to the topic of virtue signaling, my mind was completely changed on this when I heard philosopher Neil Levy. He's got 2 PhDs. One of them is in philosophy. and I heard him interviewed on the Decoding the Gurus podcast, and it was about a paper that he published April 16th, 2020, about virtue signaling. And this is usually understood as a very serious charge. It is a large part of popular conservative rhetoric against liberals and against the mainstream media and against our ruling elites and our ruling institutions, that they're constantly engaged in virtue signaling, and this is empty. But philosopher Neil Levy makes some really strong arguments here that virtue signaling is virtuous. And so he argues that we should embrace the charge of virtue signaling rather than angrily reject it. And he mounts his arguments from cognitive science, from social epistemology, and from noting what happens in the animal world. All right. It seems like a large number of living things are signaling, and maybe signaling our commitment to various social norms, to a particular hero system, to social values. Maybe it is a central, important, and justifiable function of moral discourse. And maybe it's a good thing to do. So animals use signaling for a variety of purposes. I never thought about this. Okay, gazelles famously signal their fitness for mating by stotting, meaning jumping up and down on the spot in front of predators, right? Peacocks more famously signal their fitness with their spectacular tails, right? Men are expected to signal their ability to provide by being particularly generous on first dates. Women will often signal their sexual charms very early on in dates. Both sexes understand what the opposite sex most viscerally wants. So men understand that women, generally speaking, want a man to demonstrate his ability to provide for them and to take care of them. And so he is strongly incentivized to signal his material largesse. Women are expected to, signal that they are fun, that they are alluring, and that they have all these, charms just underneath their clothes. Elliot Blatt says, taxes today, not fun. Bro, April 14. Why? Hosts of No Agenda hate even 1.5 speed playback when hearing shows. They say it causes unease and stress. Do I find this? Well, that is the overwhelming consensus of listeners. They hate when I play things that are sped up. So if I was to listen to the podcasters and live streamers who are much more successful than I am, right, they virtually never play anything at a sped up rate. So maybe they know some things. Now, good signals are hard to fake signals. If a signal is cheap, then defectors will co-opt it and it will rapidly lose its value. But starting, right, jumping up and down is a hard to fake signal because it is costly. The gazelle who can afford to waste energy it might have saved for fleeing is probably not worth chasing. The peacock's tail is an even more reliable signal because the more spectacular the tail, the more resources have been devoted to it, and the better the health of the bird. So a good signal of trustworthiness is also hard to fake. And with human beings, hard to fake signals take a variety of form. Many of them are costly. And so costly signaling may be at the root of many religious practices. So regular attendance at religious services is costly. All right, you have to forego more immediately rewarding activities. Tithing is costly. Religious rituals require privation. Fasting, right, common sign of religious commitment, right? Lent, Ramadan, Yom Kippur all involve fasting. Particularly devout individuals may take vows of celibacy or poverty or enter small cells for life, right? Some signals are not costly, but nevertheless enhance your credibility. So crossing a bridge may not be costly for the person who crosses, but it is a reliable signal that you believe the bridge is safe. And religious people are regarded by both religious and secular people, even by atheists, as more morally trustworthy than non-religious people. So I think a lot of the reason that America is so outwardly religious is that Americans have found that this is an effective way to demonstrate that you're a reliable person. Right, religious observance, right, requires hard to fake signals of trustworthiness. And so co-religionists likely will seek each other out as business partners. Right? If you publicly signal that you're willing to abide by certain publicly proclaimed norms, such as religious norms, you signal your virtue. And these displays of religiosity play an important signaling function, particularly in highly religious countries such as the United States. In secular societies, these religious signals no longer have the same power, right? Being outwardly religious no longer has the power of signaling to people that you're a good, virtuous person nearly as much in Europe and Australia as it does in the United States. So now we have more and more secular virtue signaling. Now, I remember when I first entered public school in 10th grade, 1981, Placer High School, right? I wasn't known at this school when I entered, so even though I was entering as a sophomore, I was often mistaken for a freshman, and people tried to haze me. This was a school filled with Aggies, right? People who intended to go into a career in agriculture. It was the first time that I'd heard the term white trash. And so I guess the school was filled with a lot of Scots-Irish descendants who were much more likely to engage in fighting than the previous white people I knew. So it was overwhelmingly white community, like all the other communities I grew up in, but it was overwhelmingly community, I believe, of Scots-Irish. And these were a whole different, more gnarly group of people. And one day, a group of kids, when I was early on in 10th grade, started bullying me, and I just lost my temper. It was in the school cafeteria, and I went up to one of the kids who was bullying me, and right in his face, I took out my apple, and I took a big bite of my apple. Now, I don't know why I did this. I didn't do it consciously, but I guess I was signaling. And it wasn't such a great move, right? These kids then followed me as I left the cafeteria, and they just walked out the Placer High School campus mocking me, but at least they didn't beat me up, right? Nobody bit me up. Then about a year later, that guy who I crunched my apple right in front of, we ended up collaborating because he complained that football players at Placer High School got preferential treatment when compared to other athletes such as himself who rode bicycles. And it was this article that put me on the map in my high school. I wrote it for the Hillman Messenger, a high school newspaper. And various football players got in my face afterward, including Jim Otto Jr. So Jim Otto was a terrific center for the Oakland Raiders. He played for about 20 years, and he had such devastating injuries that people ended up that he had his legs amputated. When I knew him in the early to mid 1980s, he was in tremendous knee pain. He had many knee surgeries before his legs were finally amputated. And when I worked at Cahill Radio, so basically 1982 until about 1988, he would participate in many of our programs. He was a major sponsor at the radio station. And his son was a formidable linebacker, and he had a really mean demeanor. He was kind of a scary guy. And I remember CBS Sports came out to profile him and his father because they did a segment on famous football players and their sons. So CBS Sports came out to our high school to include part of a segment on Jim Otto. Now, Jim Otto, this really mean guy in high school, the one who picked me up and threw me in a trash can because he found me so obnoxious, he's gone on to be a pastor. So he's a much more smiley, Christian, pleasant dude than the one I remember. There were a few guys I remember in high school who were quite mean. Another guy named Steve, who was like a mean, scary dude who was constantly getting into fights. Then after I graduated high school, I went to Australia for a year, came back. Steve had become a born-again Christian. He was married with kids, and he was just like the sweetest, nicest guy in the world. There's a great scene in the Robert Duvall movie Apostle where the Robert Duvall pastor character takes out his Bible and confronts an angry man and essentially converts him in the space of about 2 minutes and just completely changes the man. And that's the power of evangelical Christianity. You don't see these immediate changes of heart so much in the Roman Catholic tradition, and you don't see it so often in the Jewish tradition, but it's a major theme in the Christian tradition. So yeah, I was signaling biting into the apple. And I remember also about that article I published in the Hillman Messenger about football players getting preferential treatment. All right, my best friend at the time at the high school, a few months prior to my publishing this article, we collaborated on various ways we wanted to do this type of article because we both worked on the school newspaper. But then at crunch time, at publication time, my friend was no longer on the newspaper that semester, and now he identified more strongly with his fellow athletes because he was an athlete in a different sport, and he completely turned against me, and he seemed to lead the charge in socially stigmatizing and socially isolating me and confronting me, and he'd speak up to mock me. And I'm still friends with this guy, right? We've never discussed what happened, right? Just as we've never discussed, thank God, many of the ridiculous things that I've said and done over the years. When I first got into Judaism, circa 1990 to 92, I wanted to signal how committed I was to Judaism. And one of the ways I did this, particularly maladaptive way, I was very lonely at the time. I was living in an isolated part of Northern California, in Newcastle, California, zip code 95658 at 7955 Bullard Drive. My parents had about 7 acres out in the country, and I started cutting off people from my life. So even though I was lonely, I started cutting out people from my life who I deemed insufficiently righteous and insufficiently lacking in depth. It was one of many maladaptive 1990s interpretations that I did of Judaism and the teachings of Dennis Prager. Now, luckily, I didn't do this to my best friend at Placer High School, but for years afterward, I just kept distancing myself from people who indicated that they watched a lot of TV, including some beautiful, attractive Persian women who were only trying to bait me by saying that they watched 8 hours of TV a day. So signaling is good, but like anything, it can go awry. And my more fervent attempts to signal have been completely ridiculous. So Iran is signaling here, and I see a lot of strong arguments in their favor why this is a particularly effective way to signal. All right, they're telling their allies that they're standing up to Israel, and they are sending like $1,000 drones against Israel, which then require Israel to expend $1 million rockets, right? So you can send weapons that cost $1,000 or a few $1,000s against your enemy, and he has to spend millions of dollars per missile to take down your $1,000 drones, right? That seems like a winning exchange. So just on the basis of economics and on the basis of depleting Israel's arsenal, on the basis of millions of Israelis had to seek shelter during this attack, right? On the basis of flexing their abilities, right? You can make a strong argument that Iran won yesterday. But Sam Vaknin, an Israeli leftist now living in Belgium, he has a different perspective.
My name is Sam Vaknin, and I'm a columnist in Brussels Morning. Israel bombed a structure that served the Iranian consulate in Damascus. Though not strictly within the compound of the embassy, it was widely known as an outpost of Iranian diplomacy in Syria. The language of Articles 21 to 25 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, dated 1961. This language is clear. Embassies and consulates are not sovereign territory. They are not extraterritorial. They just enjoy certain legal exemptions. That's all. So why did Iran choose to escalate and retaliate by attacking Israel with a barrage of 300 unmanned aerial vehicles, also known as drones, as well as cruise missiles and ballistic missiles? Because of the growing threat to its out-of-control proxies everywhere. Hamas, the Houthis, the Hezbollah, first and foremost. Iran needed to reassert its authority over these terrorist organizations by being seen to fearlessly conflict directly with the little devil, Israel. But the attack misfired in every conceivable way. More than 97% of the weapons launched were intercepted long before they had reached the borders of Israel, exposing the inefficacy of drones and even missiles as decisive factors in modern warfare, set as they are against high-tech defenses. The onslaught on Israel diverted attention, at least momentarily, from the plight of the Palestinians.
Glib Medley's got a good comment in the chat. He says, if your phone does not have at least a 40% charge, please leave the stream until your charge is at least at 70%, because the amount of charge that you have on your phone, according to one study, seems to correlate with your credit score. And that's my real life experience. My real life experience for people whose phone's no longer working, their phone's out of charge, and it's the excuse they give you for not getting back or not meeting an appointment with you. It always indicates, in my experience, a flaky person. And this lack of charge on your phone is just an outward manifestation of someone who can't keep it together.
In Gaza and the much heralded Israeli invasion of Rafah. It is a distraction window, of opportunity that Israel might use to push on with its offensive. The United States, France, the United Kingdom, and even Jordan sided with Israel against Iran. It is a reminder that Sunni countries are actually quite elated with the damage that Israel is inflicting on Shia, Iran, and its proxies, both Sunni and Shia. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt regard Israel as a handy and welcome buffer against Iran's expansionist dreams, and in the face of the Iran-sponsored death cults that cloak themselves in Muslim Brotherhood religious political ideology. Finally, Iran's buffoonish retribution is humiliating. It exposes the incompetence and corruption of the theocracy. Coupled with a tanking economy, it will lead to civil unrest within Iran, and perhaps to the rise of a more reformist streak of political Islam. All these positive outcomes depend on Israel's next move. Biden's sage advice to Netanyahu was to take the win and gloat over Iran's debacle. But far-right forces within Israel have been spoiling for a regional war with the arch-enemy Iran for many years now. Netanyahu himself may provoke a regional kerfuffle in order to divert attention from his legal woes and force the United States to commit to his agenda. Such a course of action, however, would amount to an unmitigated disaster for the Jewish state. Israel cannot defeat Iran, especially when it is already fighting a war on multiple other fronts. The USA will not be dragged into Israeli adventurism. It will rather abandon Israel to its fate. Should it choose to confront Iran now, Israel will have completed its transformation into the second North Korea, a pariah state.
Okay, interesting commentary there from Sam Vaknin. It was the opposite of what I was thinking at the time. All right, when I listened to it. So I was thinking that Iran is showing a savvy foreign policy. And then listening to Sam Vaknin, it made me rethink everything. All right, looking at comments here from Bell. Luke, look at what the No Agenda show says about COVID injection videos, that after a certain number of doses, there are increased chances of certain bad things happening to you. This is what John Campbell says in his newest video. John Campbell has a PhD in nursing, is an absolute crank. I just find it not a good use of my time to take seriously anything he states. Now, everything comes with side effects. If you take the vaccine, there are side effects. If you don't take the vaccine, all right, there are side effects. All right, there's nothing that you can do that does not have a side effect. If you exercise, there are side effects. You may injure yourself. You may strain yourself. You may rob yourself of cognitive processing powers that are more needed than the physical exertion, all right? You're not going to be able to think as clearly, usually, after vigorous physical exertion. You can drink too much water. So taking the vaccine has side effects. Not taking the vaccine has side effects. To me, the evidence is overwhelming that the side effects of not taking the COVID vaccine and not taking COVID boosters dramatically outweigh the side effects of taking the vaccine and its boosters, just as the side effects and dangers of wearing a seatbelt are dramatically smaller than the side effects and dangers of not wearing a seatbelt. Will the American military clear out of Gaza now? I don't think so. So apparently 196 aid workers have been killed in the Gaza conflict. Is that really that much higher than other forms of urban warfare? I mean, I think it's great that Israel is criticized when it seems to have screwed up and unnecessarily killed aid workers. On the other hand, are there any live fire urban warfare situations where innocents don't die? So I'm not sure that Israel is, particularly more inept or evil or careless and sloppy with the lives of aid workers than, say, Americans or the British or the Japanese or other nations that are fighting in urban warfare. Bell notes, the No Agenda show said the diplomacy attack, meaning the April 1 attack, April 1st, was likely approved. The Iran government likely hated the general that was killed. But the missiles fired at Israel means that this theory is incorrect. this guy reads well. He's talking about Sam Vaknin, but his eyes are all over his screen, obviously reading a script. Look forward content has side effects of audio wellness. If the jab is so effective, why did Big Pharma need immunity? Well, there are lots of good things that people can do that place themselves in legal jeopardy of being sued. So just because you place yourself in legal jeopardy of being sued, it does not mean that you're doing the wrong thing. So many good Samaritans have tried to, help someone who's in desperate circumstances, and then they've been sued by the person that they helped. Have you watched the show Loudermilk? Right, 3 seasons of it, or I think on Netflix. It's about a tough love, tough talking, kind of negative, critical alcohol and drug abuse counselor named Sam Loudermilk, who was a former pop music critic. And he saves a man who's choking. And then the man sues him because in the process of performing the Heimlich maneuver, Sam Loudermilk broke 1 or 2 of his ribs. And Sam Loudermilk saved the choking guy in front of this woman he desired and her boyfriend at the time, who was a doctor. But the doctor knew more about the legal consequences that he would face for interfering with the choking guy. And so the doctor stood back while Sam Loudermilk stepped up, possibly saved the guy's life, but then he ends up getting sued. And a lot of people acting as good Samaritans, acting in good faith, trying to help people in desperate circumstances, end up getting sued. So just because you are sued does not mean that you're doing the wrong thing. You can publish important articles that are in the public interest that then expose yourself to legal liability, even though you're telling the truth, because you may not be able to reveal your sources. So effectively, to defend against a libel lawsuit, you need to be able to reveal your sources. But if you have promised your sources anonymity, then you cannot reveal your sources. Then the judge will likely sanction you, and you'll face enormous legal bills, and you'll be in great peril, even though you've done the pro-social thing, you've done the good thing, you've done the righteous thing. You have alerted people to something nefarious going on, but your antagonist may well use the legal system to try to hurt you. So usually if you get sued, right, it's because you have done something to hurt somebody and you have acted in a way that has brought the problem on yourself, and you have very likely acted in a way that's not been in the public interest. But sometimes when you get sued, you have acted in the public interest and you get sued anyway. So providing immunity to Big Pharma over fast-tracking COVID vaccines does not necessarily mean that the COVID vaccines are dangerous. Okay, here's John Mearsheimer from a few days ago, prior to the attack.
Even worse, this is going to put a greater stain on Israel's reputation. It's going to cause greater pressure to be brought to bear on the Biden administration, which of course is complicit.
Okay, what about the tactics to silence people asking valid questions? Well, how are they silenced and how valid are their questions? So most of the quote-unquote valid questions that I hear or see or read about are absurd, and they come from people who simply don't know very much. So should we stigmatize? Should we mock? Should we poke fun at people who make proclamations that have no or very little factual validity? Right? I think we should. And so you can say, oh, I was just asking questions, but asking questions is often one of the lamest excuses for saying things publicly that simply don't stand up on their merits, and then people just retreat to just asking questions. So for me, the evidence is overwhelming that COVID vaccines and COVID boosters are overwhelmingly likely to be in the public interest and to be in your personal interest. And overwhelmingly, the people who try to make the case against the COVID vaccine and COVID boosters are cranks. I don't know anyone publicly making the case against COVID vaccines and COVID boosters who's not a crank. Nurse Campbell goes over a Japanese study. Well, not all studies have equal validity. Just because there's a Japanese study and a Korean study and a Chinese study and an American study does not mean that all studies have equal validity. Generally speaking, the gold standard in studies is a comprehensive meta-analysis. So when I hear crank health advice and commentary, I usually ask, well, give me the meta-analysis that backs up what you're saying. But people are never prepared to do this. Instead, they come up with all sorts of delusional bases for their arguments, such as a tweet here and a Facebook post there, right? Some of these quote unquote studies are by well-known anti-vaccine activists, right, who are able to publish their quote unquote studies in low prestige journals that have no standards, and then they crank it out, and then Tucker Carlson and Jean-Francois Garapi say, oh, look here, there's a study that says that the COVID vaccine is dangerous, but the study itself is absolute crap. Right? Just because it's a study doesn't mean it has validity. Show me comprehensive, well-done meta-analyses, meaning you take all high-powered, comprehensive studies done in a particular area and you plot them in a meta-analysis, right? That's usually the gold standard. Do I have cognitive bias? Yes, I have cognitive bias. We all do. I think no evidence will change your mind. Oh, I'm waiting to see any evidence. Right? Where's the comprehensive meta-analysis making the case that COVID vaccines are bad? 80% of people initially were getting vaccinated, and now boosters are down to 20%. I wonder why. Well, there could be many reasons, and not necessarily because the boosters are ineffective, right? People do not ally their behavior perfectly in alignment with evidence. Okay, let's play a little bit more John Mearsheimer.
In this genocide, and on the Israelis themselves to put an end to this. So this is not going to improve the situation either militarily or politically for the Israelis. Going into Rafah is going to make a horrible situation even worse.
Going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, Professor Mearsheimer, with the Israeli destruction of the Iranian consulate, would they have given warning to the U.S. before this happened? Wouldn't the U.S. say, for heaven's sakes, don't do that because we don't want to be dragged in? We're giving you all the help we can.
That's a great question. I don't have a good answer.
And chat says they lied to us about vaccine. So think about the dilemma that people in public life trying to give a public message have, right? They need to give a message that is equally understandable to people with below average IQs as people with above average IQs. So they often simplify the message and say things that are factually not true. So in the rush to urge people to get COVID vaccines, there are a lot of politicians who said, well, if you get vaccinated, you're not going to transmit the virus. And that was factually wrong. So people in public life often overstate the benefits of a particular course of action. On the other hand, you have to have some sympathy for people who try to make a public case and try to communicate it to people with 85 IQs as well as 135 IQs, all right? Ideally, you'd have completely different messages for people with a 125 IQ compared to people with a 95 IQ.
I would imagine that if they told us, we would have moved heaven and earth to tell them or convince them or coerce them not to attack.
All right, so that's why Israel would not want to notify the U.S. I mean, you're often going to do things that if you tell your boss or you tell your parents or you tell your spouse, right, they're going to say no, and they're going to do everything that they can to stop you.
Attack the embassy. I would guess, and this is just a guess, they didn't tell us because they understood how we thought about that. You remember when we sent those aircraft carriers over in the beginning?
Right.
We did it not because we wanted to join into the war or join the war. We did it because we wanted to deter escalation. We have no interest in escalation. We're trying to actually de-escalate this conflict we now have with the Houthis. So we
Okay, one of the most stupid things that I see in the news in reaction to the Iran attack, and also in reaction to Israel's response to the Black Saturday, October 7 attack in southern Israel, one of the most stupid tropes that I hear in the news is that Israel does not want to escalate this conflict. I mean, that's absurd, right? Israel clearly wants to escalate this conflict, right? There are a lot of reasons why Israel would want to escalate this conflict. It would get the United States in more explicitly, more powerfully to batter Israel's enemies, right? If Israel, by attacking next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus, pulls the United States into the Middle East war, right, Israel has reason to believe the United States will start damaging and killing its enemies. Why would it not want to? So I remember the New York Times, January 14 this year, had a headline, "The regional war no one wanted is here. How wide will it get?" This is absurd. Right? Plenty of people want a wider war in the Middle East. Right? Hamas would love a wider war in the Middle East because Hamas is getting decimated currently. Parts of Hezbollah, parts of the government of Iran, and significant parts of the government of Israel want a wider war. Right? Hezbollah has the capacity to devastate Israel, to level its cities, and to kill thousands of Israelis in a matter of hours. Why would members of Hezbollah not feel tempted to do that? Iran wants to dominate the Middle East, destroy the Zionist state, and drive America out of the Middle East. Right? A massive war with Israel, right? Some in the Iranian regime or in the Hezbollah regime think that this would be wonderful. All right, so a massive war with Israel, on the other hand, might topple the Iranian regime, but it also might topple the Zionist state. And it might make America's presence in the Middle East more precarious. Now, many Israeli leaders want a wider war because this might enable them to drive out the Arabs from the West Bank and Gaza and possibly even Israel proper and create a stronger, more cohesive, greater Israel. You can make a very strong argument that a greater Israel with no Palestinians in their midst and fewer Arabs in their midst is in the best interests of Israel's cohesion and strength. Right? Why is Israel stronger when it contains millions of people who hate it? On the other hand, this is probably not in America's best interests. I think we'll see Israel in the next few months invading southern Lebanon to take out Hezbollah. Right. And here are two philosophical reasons why I think this argument that nobody wants a wider regional war is just stupid. One, people usually do not say what they mean. People don't mean what they say. They usually don't mean what they say or say what they mean. Right? Just because many leaders in the Middle East say they don't want a wider regional war doesn't mean that's what they truly believe in all circumstances. In some circumstances, they may not want a wider war. In other circumstances, they do. Right? I believe that probably the most powerful leaders of Iran and Hezbollah do not want a wider war, but plenty of people around them do. Bibi Netanyahu's leadership depends on a wider war, an ongoing war. Once there's peace, Bibi Netanyahu's likely out of office, but he can't say this publicly. He has to placate the United States in his public pronouncements. He has to placate coalition members to his right in private. What is in Bibi Netanyahu's best interests as a politician probably not aligned with what's in America's best interests or Israel's best interests. So individual incentives are often different from national incentives. Partisan political incentives are often different from what's incentivized for the nation as a whole, right? Bibi's incentives are not necessarily Israel's incentives. Now, two, the news media is dominated by liberal leftists, and people on the left believe that people are basically good and that peace is our default state. Now, traditional people, conservatives, people on the right, do not believe that people are basically good, and they do not believe that peace is our default state. They understand that sometimes wars have to be fought to a conclusion to allow a lasting peace, because there has not been a conclusive end to the Arab-Israeli conflicts. There's no peace in the Middle East. So also on the liberal left side of the political spectrum, there's often an individualist worldview, particularly more on the liberal side, and there is more power, more confidence in the power of the detached, buffered human reason and agency to manage things, right? Think about LBJ, President Lyndon Baines Johnson's micromanaging of the bombing of North Vietnam. On the right, people believe that we are primarily driven by our genes and our early imprinting and by our tribe, that we're inherently tribal, and that we tend to be driven and dominated by many forces far more powerful than our conscious cognition. and therefore we suspect that life and war are inherently wild, and they are less manageable and less containable than those who believe in a liberal perspective. Right? The liberal perspective is that we are primarily individuals born with certain inalienable rights. A tribal perspective, a traditional perspective, is that we are profoundly social beings, that we are profoundly tribal, and that individualism is of secondary importance. So liberalism downplays the social nature of human beings and the genetic capabilities of human beings, almost to the point of ignoring it. And liberalism tends to treat people as atomistic actors. This is the point that John Mearsheimer made in his great 2018 book, The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Reality. So political liberalism is an ideology that is essentially individualist at its core and assigns great importance to the concept of inalienable rights. If you're a tribalist or a nationalist, you understand that rights are contingent on the situation, and that the rights that a nation may apportion will depend on its circumstances and what's in the best interest of a nation. Right? In some circumstance, you want a xenophobic police state. Right? When you're fighting for your life, right, like your immune system, you want a xenophobic police state. In other circumstances, it's more adaptive and more likely to result in human flourishing and prosperity to allow for more individualism and more individual rights. It depends on the circumstance whether the nation is better off according more or fewer rights to its individuals. Liberal states tend to pursue ambitious foreign policies on the basis of universalism and inalienable rights. Right? Human rights have essentially defined the most elevated aspirations of our political and social elites. But from a non-liberal perspective, humans are not primarily lone wolves. We are primarily born into families, extended families, social groups, tribes, and societies, and these shape our identities much more than our individual proclivities, right? We are tribal to our core. And the things that most influence us are our genes and the incentives that we get from our tribe. And despite its elevated ranking in the liberal worldview, reason is about the least important of the three major ways that we determine how we speak and act. It's less important than the socialization we receive from our family and community, and it's less important than our genetic impulses. So reason is a pretty weak read. So the Biden administration believes a great deal in the power of reason to control and to contain these international conflicts. And Harvard foreign policy international relations scholar Stephen Walt, who was John Mearsheimer's co-author in their book, The Israel Lobby, he recently said to Robert Wright a few weeks ago, the Biden administration is the revenge of the foreign policy blob, right? Foreign policy for every major nation is essentially run by a tiny number of people. It's not decided along the lines of democratic preferences. So after the Trumpian interlude, you brought back the foreign policy blob. They regard themselves as the foreign policy professionals, right? The Obama team is back in action and taking the band on the road under the Biden administration. So the Biden foreign policy team has great confidence in its abilities to manage the world, and thus has created, greater disasters in foreign policy than any American administration since World War II.
We don't want another conflict with Iran or with Hezbollah, but the Israelis, I believe, they would like to drag us in. And
Can you envision a full-fledged war between the United States and Iran, in which we have troops on the ground and naval personnel and ships and jet fighters and missiles and bombs over there?
Well, I don't think there'll be boots on the ground. I think if there's a war between us and Iran, it will involve naval ships, aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and so forth and so on. And I don't want to minimize what a disaster that would be, but I don't think we're going to invade Iran. That is a bridge too far.
Were you surprised at all at the revelation last week of the Israeli use of AI with these three programs, one with the crazy name of Lavender, the other, the offensive name to me of...
How wimpy is this? All right, he is offended by the name of these AI programs. Right? I haven't been offended by a political or cultural or religious opinion in my life, to the best of my knowledge. I don't understand these snowflakes who go around getting offended so easily.
Where's your daddy? and gospel. These programs, according to the Israeli journalist who exposed them, revealed the putting of numbers on an image of members of Hamas. 100 is must kill, 1 is the other end of that. And then putting facial recognition and numbers and whatever other information they had into the computer, and the computer deciding when and where to kill, but programmed to do so for maximum damage, so that a daddy was killed when his wife and children were there as well. Does this surprise you? Is this some legitimate excuse of Prime Minister Netanyahu that the computer did it?
No, this doesn't surprise me. And this is part of the genocidal campaign, along with the famine.
So I don't agree that Israel's invasion of Gaza is a genocide, but I had no problem with those who do see it that way. After all, 33,000 Gazans apparently have been killed, and there's a lot of dehumanizing rhetoric on the part of Israel's leaders. So I understand why many people have lost friendships in arguing over the definition of genocide. I hope to never lose friendships over the definition of genocide. It doesn't matter to me one way or another. Now, it does seem to me that Israel has been more successful than any other nation of which I'm aware in fighting in urban warfare in keeping civilian deaths to a minimum. So apparently, the ratio of civilian deaths to militant deaths is about 1.5 to 1, or possibly getting close to 2 to 1. And the norm in this type of urban warfare is a ratio of 9 civilian deaths to 1 militant death. So it seems to me that Israel's doing a pretty good job keeping down civilian casualties. But we all benefit from accurate criticism, and we often benefit from criticism that is less than 100% accurate. And so Israel may benefit from some of this criticism.
The Israelis are behind. So this doesn't surprise me. The person who wrote this article is named Yuval Abraham, and it's in a magazine that all of your viewers should read. It's called Plus 972. This is the second major piece by Yuval Abraham on the air war, on the Israeli air war. And it is very important to understand that, first of all, he's an Israeli. And second, the 2 articles that he's written, including the one that you described, the other one was last November, that both of those pieces are based on extended conversations with people who are planning and conducting the war. So he has huge amounts of hard evidence. And in the first article that he wrote last November, he made it manifestly clear, or the article made it manifestly clear, that the Israelis were inflicting massive punishment on the civilian population on purpose. And this was not precision-guided weaponry at work. They were trying to kill large numbers of innocent Palestinians. And what you see with the more recent article that you just described is more.
Why would Israel not want to kill Palestinians? It was Palestinians who invaded southern Israel, right? It's Palestinians who've been a thorn in Israel's side for 70 years. Right? Why would Israel not want to kill them? Well, the most obvious answer is that Israel would lose support from its allies by gratuitously killing. In Anglo countries like the United States, Anglo countries like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, England, right? There's a lot of rhetoric about the beauties of individualism, that you should treat people primarily as individuals rather than as collectives, as members of a group, right? So this individualist rhetoric is beautiful. It has its application, but that's a moral ideal, a philosophical ideal. How does the world work? The world works in corporate ways much more than individualist ways. So in the United States, we get a lot of rhetoric about the beauties of democracy, but the world primarily operates along the lines of authoritarianism. When you go to work, when you go to school, when you go to church, you're not primarily going to a place that is run on democratic lines. You're going to a place that is run on authoritarian lines. Most of life, as you encounter it, will be run on authoritarian lines. So we have all this rhetoric about the beauties of democracy, and yet the reality of our lives is that authority tends to be the way things get done, and it tends to be the most efficient form of operating a group. So too, individualism has its many beauties, but the way the world works is corporately. Right? When you behave badly, all right, it does not primarily reflect on you in the wider world. It primarily reflects on the groups that you're a member of. It primarily reflects on your family, your tribe, your religion, your race, right? If you go out there and you have several unpleasant interactions with members of an outgroup, with members of a different race or religion, you will start to have more and more negative feelings about that, entire race or entire religion or entire ethnic group. And you will bring those negative feelings into your interactions with individual members of that group. Now, if you happen to get to know those individuals in a deeper way, you may well overcome your inherent negative feelings about the outgroup. But the world is run on corporate lines, right? When terrorists try to harm an enemy, all right, they are aiming to inflict as much terror on their enemy's group, civilian group, as possible. And often the most effective way to combat this type of terror is not primarily killing terrorists, but killing terrorists and all those who support or aim or have any affiliation or connection with them. So I am not shocked that Israel may have perhaps passed up opportunities to kill terrorists when they are on their own, and instead has chosen to kill terrorists when they are with their families, right? That may be a more effective strategy. It may be a less effective strategy, all right? Nobody confuses me for an expert on combating terror. But it does seem to me, right, that the way the world works is largely corporate rather than individual.
Of the same, except we get all of this detail about these programs like Lavender. And I would just note, building on what you said, that what I found most shocking was the story that Yuval Abraham tells about Lavender, which is that the Israelis, instead of killing someone who's in Hamas, when that fighter is by himself or with other Hamas fighters, waits till the person goes home and is with his family so that they can kill not only him, but kill the family. This is just horrible.
Why is it horrible? It makes sense to me. This is how the world works. It may not be the best policy. All right, the strategy of just killing individual terrorists may be more effective. There may be more externalities that are positive. But if you have a terrorist in your family, why would you expect to be immune from consequences?
That, by definition, by the way, is a war crime. By definition.
Of course.
Yeah, a lot of things are crimes and also effective, right? People speed all the time, right? They break the speed limit because they judge that to be a more effective strategy at navigating life than following the law, right? When a nation is fighting for its survival, right, I would expect it to do that which is in its best interests, and that sometimes may mean a war crime.
American, all of whom were white.
Okay, this is John Mearsheimer about 10 days ago, so well prior to the latest Iranian direct attacks on Israel.
None of whom was Palestinian. What do you think the international...
So talking about Israel's killing of 196 aid workers in Gaza.
Reaction will be to that?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the international reaction has been one of outrage. It's interesting. By most accounts, the Israelis have probably killed about 196 people who have been involved in transporting food around Gaza. Just think about 196 people. But there's not been much of a protest regarding those people because they were Palestinians. But here you have a case where 7 white people are killed, and there is moral outrage in the extreme. I think that the Americans are really serious about talking to Netanyahu about putting an end to this, although they won't put any real pressure on him in the end.
Well, the the mainstream media is reporting in the past 15 minutes that the White House has leaked that the president spoke directly with Prime Minister Netanyahu in what the White House calls a tense conversation. I don't know what these conversations are like. I assume that they see each other, and I assume that they each are surrounded by many aides. Netanyahu, of course, speaks fluent English, so translators are not needed, but Biden must have people there. Supposedly, President Biden threatened to pivot U.S. policy if the slaughter of civilians doesn't stop. Do you think he would do that?
No, I don't. I think he's all talk and no action. He's done nothing up to now. And remember, genocide.
Why is Joe Biden, United States, all talk and no action in this regard? Because the United States does not have that much leverage over Israel. Right? Israel independently has a very strong military. Right? If America had tremendous leverage over Israel, then it'd be worth putting in all this time discussing how should America react to what Israel's doing in Gaza. But just as the United States had very little leverage over the regimes ruling Afghanistan between 2002 and 2021, right? So too, the United States has very little leverage over Israel.
It has been taking place for a long period of time now. It's readily apparent to almost everybody, but he's done nothing to stop it. In fact, if anything, he is complicitous in the genocide. So I find it hard to believe that he is now all of a sudden going to get tough with Israel.
Here's Jose Andres, the chef and founder of World Central Kitchen. He's born in Spain, but he's an American citizen. It's a very moving cut. It's gone viral. I would like your thoughts on it, Professor.
What I know is that we were targeted deliberately, non-stop, until everybody was dead in this convoy. This happened over more than 1.5, 1.8 kilometers. So this was not just a bad luck situation where, we dropped the bomb in the wrong place or no, this was over 1.5, 1.8 kilometers with a very defined humanitarian convoy that had signs in the top, in the roof.
Yeah, and how often does this happen in this type of warfare, right? It always happens in urban warfare. Right? People think that they can go be heroes in the middle of a war and not get hurt. Right? People want virtue on the cheap. People want heroic status without losing anything. But if you go put yourself in the middle of a war, even if it's for the most Christian of reasons, even if it's for the most highest of ethical reasons, right, you have deliberately put yourself in danger. And why would someone do that, particularly in Gaza?
That cannot be the role of an army. That cannot be the role of an army that has...
Well, I don't know of any examples of armies that have not done this.
Hundreds of drones above Gaza in any single moment. Humanitarians and civilians should never be paying the consequences of war.
Humanitarians and civilians should never, pay the consequences of war. And the laws of gravity should not affect me when I don't want them to. And yet they will, right? The world is run by certain inexorable laws. And one of the inexorable laws is if you put yourself in the middle of a vicious fight, right, you are very likely to get hurt. You are much more likely to get hurt if you put yourself in the middle of a vicious battle than if you do not put yourself in the middle of a vicious battle.
This is a basic principle of humanity. At the time, this looks like it's not a war against terrorism anymore. Seems this is a war against humanity itself.
Wow, a war against humanity itself. Scott Ritter amplified that with his own reporting. The Israelis claimed they thought there was a member of Hamas in one of the cars, as if that would justify killing everybody else that's in the car. But they've been doing this collective punishment since October. But Scott reports that there were 2 bodyguards in that car, very, very astute, serious professionals who never would have allowed a Hamas person anywhere near the car for fear that something like what happened might happen, and to save their own lives, which of course were lost.
Well, I think it's just important to understand that the Israelis, since the very beginning, have been trying to systematically starve the Palestinians in Gaza. You want to remember that
And what's the evidence that, what number of Gazans do we understand to have died from starvation?
2 days after October 7th, this is obviously October 9th, Yoav Gallant, who is the Minister of Defense in Israel, said that there was going to be a complete lockdown on Gaza. There was going to be no food, no water, no fuel, no medicine that got into Gaza. And all sorts of Israelis have made the same basic argument since then. You also want to understand that inside the Israeli population, right, a public opinion poll has just been done that shows that 68% of Israelis, now think about this, 68% of Israelis believe that no humanitarian aid should be allowed into Gaza. This is a population in Gaza.
And what percentage of Palestinians would like the death and destruction of Jewish Israelis, right? Both sides absolutely loathe each other. It's not surprising that neither side is particularly eager to help the other, right? They're in a fight to the death. Until one side clearly, convincingly triumphs, you're going to have this ongoing conflict.
That is on the verge of famine. People are starving. They are close to death. And what the Israelis are doing is doing.
And the chat says Netanyahu works for the hidden hands of rabbis. I remember him being poked in the chest by a rabbi and told to bring the Mashiach. Netanyahu isn't run by the rabbis. Netanyahu is overwhelmingly secular. It's in his own political interests to make obeisances to rabbis. But nobody who's seriously informed about how the Israeli government operates believes that its most important decisions are being run by hidden groups of rabbis.
Doing everything they can to prevent food and more generally humanitarian aid from getting into the Gaza Strip. And part of that operation involves destroying food convoys. It's much more extensive than that. They actually go after buildings where the food is located. They slow walk the aid in and so forth and so on.
And why would you expect otherwise, right, when a country's in a fight to the death? Right. Do we need American troops in Iran, in Taiwan?
Battlefield delivered to them by a brave and hardy group in Ukraine with the support of China. In particular, dual-use capabilities, a variety of other efforts, industrial and commercial, Russia has retooled and now poses a threat to Ukraine as we are struggling to get the supplemental. But not just to Ukraine, its newfound capabilities pose a longer-term challenge to stability in Europe and threatens NATO allies.
I misidentified Mr. Campbell. As you can see, he's the Deputy Secretary of State. I don't know if that's the job Victoria Nuland had or if it's another job, but
that is the job that Nuland wanted, and the Biden administration chose him for the job. And until he was confirmed, I think it was in February, she filled that position.
Got it. But I'm startled that he's saying what he said. And do you agree with that the Russian military is stronger now, that it is, to quote him, completely retooled?
Absolutely. The Russian military today is much larger and much more formidable than it was when it invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. There's no question about that. And the Ukrainian military is weaker today than it was in the early months or the first year, if you want to put it, of the war. And this is why Ukraine is in a hopeless situation and should cut some sort of deal. Now, the argument that Kurt makes that the Russians are a threat to conquer all of Ukraine and conquer territory in Eastern Europe is not a serious argument.
No,
The
that's
Russians-
political. That's political claptrap. He's expressing gratitude to the people that got him the job that Newland wanted.
Yeah, well, it also, I think, is rhetoric that the administration uses for purposes of getting this bill through Congress or getting the aid package through
Right,
Congress,
right.
the $61 billion.
Right. Are American troops engaged in some sort of war games or training or practice or advising or something with respect to Taiwanese troops on an island or islands off the coast of Taiwan?
Yes, it's quite important to emphasize that in February of this year, we decided that we would permanently station troops, not large numbers, but small numbers of troops in Taiwan that are tasked with training the Taiwanese. And some of those troops, it appears, are on these two islands, Kinmen and Pengju, that are very close to the Chinese mainland. They're in effect between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. And those troops are engaging, those American troops are engaging in training the Taiwanese.
And what are they? I mean, they're doing this under the nose and in the shadow of the mainland. What are they training the Taiwanese for? To interact with American troops should the mainland invade and a president of the United States be crazy enough to send American troops there to defend Taiwan in the face of the one China policy? I don't get this.
Well, I think what's going on here is we are sending a signal to the Chinese that we will defend Taiwan. I mean, this is a tripwire force. It's hard to figure out exactly what the numbers are. I would guess the number will be somewhere between 100 and 200 American troops, maybe a little larger, maybe a little smaller. But it's not a force that's going to be able to fend off a Chinese amphibious assault against the Taiwan Strait at some point down the road. What it's designed to do is serve as a tripwire and bring us into any war that breaks out over Taiwan.
All right, to be clear, by tripwire, you mean these people are sitting ducks, and if they are attacked, that's the American justification for sending massive numbers of troops there to retaliate against the attackers.
That's one way of looking at it, but I would put a slightly different spin on it. And I would argue that what the administration is doing is simply sending a signal to the Chinese that we are going to defend Taiwan. And therefore, you better not invade Taiwan because it will involve a great power war between the United States and China.
Well, how much longer is this going to go on? I mean, is this intentional provocation, Professor Mearsheimer?
The way you want to think about this is to ask yourself a simple question. You're dealing with a country, China, that is not a status quo power. It wants to take Taiwan back. It wants to turn the South China Sea into a giant Chinese lake. And it basically believes it should control the East China Sea and those small islands that the Japanese now control in the East China Sea. And do you, as an American, think we have a vested interest in preventing China from doing any of those things? Or do you think that we should just stand back and allow China to take Taiwan, to dominate the South China Sea, and to dominate the East China Sea? Where you come down on that question determines how you think about troops in Taiwan or American naval forces in the South China Sea, or what have you.
Does China want to invade the United States or trade with the United States?
it absolutely does not want to invade the United States. But the question is, should the United States allow China to dominate Asia? Should the United States allow China to take Taiwan and to dominate the East China Sea and the South China Sea? You have to have an answer to that. And the same argument applies to past historical cases like Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Imperial Germany, and Imperial Japan. Do you think it mattered whether those countries dominated either Europe or Asia? In the past, we have decided that we cannot allow a Germany or a Japan or the Soviet Union to dominate one of those two regions. That's Asia or Europe. And that basic question is at play here with regard to East Asia and China today. If you don't believe that we should care whether China dominates Asia, then we shouldn't fight for Taiwan or for the South China Sea. But if you think otherwise, then you have to think about clever ways to deter China. China, it's very important to understand, is not a status quo power in East Asia. It's a revisionist power. It's the United States that wants to maintain the status quo in East Asia for obvious reasons. We're the top dog. The Chinese don't like the fact that we're the top dog in their backyard, and they want to change that situation. Who can blame them? But we are bent on preventing them from doing that. Now, you could argue that we shouldn't care one way or the other. But if you do care, that explains a lot about what's going on in East.
So about 95% of Japan's petroleum imports go right past Taiwan. So Japan faces significant reasons to side with Taiwan. Much of China's oil comes through straits that go past Australia. So Australia has also reasons to defend Taiwan. All right, looking at the chat. Luke, you have had moments of weakness when going on runs. Father time, aging, or is it perhaps what you shoved into your sacred arm? Perhaps it was the COVID vaccines and boosters. So I always had poor health until less than 3 years ago, right? The summer till June of 2021, when I started taking beef organ capsules and all my health problems went away. So my crazy vegetarian diet that I carried on from my family has led to a lifetime of poor health. Within 2 weeks of taking my daily 6 beef organ capsules, these health problems went away. So now, over the past nearly 3 years, I'm in the best health that I've been since I was 21 years of age. But my workout does not consist of much aerobic exercise. So if I'm running upstairs, right, usually by the 3rd flight of stairs, I'm huffing and puffing. But it was this way before I ever took any, COVID shots, and it's this way now. So my workouts, such as they are, consist of probably averaging about 5 miles a day of walking, and then every other day I do pull-ups and push-ups and some weights. So I can do up to about 4 pull-ups, which is more than I've been able to do since I was 21, but I haven't been doing the aerobic exercise. Also, however, I experienced the COVID vaccine and its boosters. Says nothing about the overall effectiveness of the COVID vaccine. I'm just one guy, right? I'm just an anecdote. So whether I thrive or whether I suffer from COVID vaccines and boosters says nothing overall about the efficacy of COVID vaccines. Looking at the chat, the aged rabbinic scholars are highly looked up to and conferred with to determine Israel's policy. And where's your evidence for this, right? Who are the scholars of how Israel's government works that support your allegations, right? What are the books that support your allegations? Where are the meta-analyses that support your allegations? I don't think there are any. If Israel was purely secular, they wouldn't care about holy lands. Australia is overwhelmingly secular, but for Australians, Australia is a holy land, right? Australia's beaches are Australia's cathedrals, right? Every strongly identifying people has holy land, whether or not they use the particular phrase, holy. So every strongly identifying people has a particular identification with a particular piece of land. If Israel wasn't running run by rabbis. They wouldn't build a sacrificial altar to slaughter the red heifer. The religion is the core of Israel. Well, there's just no evidence for that. You'll find a few fringe Jews who desperately want to rebuild the third temple and slaughter the red heifer, but you're not going to find much evidence that this devotion drives the overwhelmingly secular Israeli government, except for those instances where they need to recruit the political support of religious parties. Jews believe they are superior to Palestinians and the rest of the world due to what? Their religion? No, every strongly identifying people believes is superior to everyone else. Right? Strongly identifying Japanese believe they are superior to the rest of the world. Right? The Japanese flag has the rising sun on it because the Japanese traditionally have had the belief that the sun rises first on Japan and goes to the rest of the world. Chinese, strongly identifying Chinese, believe that China is superior. As Dennis Prager notes, the word China means center of the earth. Chinese regard themselves as the greatest civilization and the center of the world, and they believe that they are rightfully superior to every other people. Every strongly identifying people believe that they are superior to everyone else, and then they will come up for reasons to justify that instinctive belief. Right? If you have any kind of in-group identity, you believe that your group is superior to others. Now, if you're challenged to justify that, your brain will start to seek for rational, empirical, logical reasons to support your instinctive belief. But the normal, natural, and even healthy thing is to believe that your group, your people, is superior to everyone else, and then you will use your reason, if necessary, to try to come up with arguments for that. So you'll come up with arguments for why your television is superior to other people's television. The British, for example, often feel like their telly is just so much wiser and deeper than American telly. Every individual, every group will try to find ways why it enjoys a special place in the universe, right? Our greatest fear is insignificance, so we are simply wired to come up for reasons why we're insignificant. So I currently do a show that gets relatively few viewers. So right now there are about 40 people watching me live, about 24 on YouTube and a few on Twitter, and about 10 on Rumble and 1 on Odyssey and other places. So I come up with reasons for why, this just shows how intellectually demanding my show is. This just shows what a high average IQ level my show is pitched at. On the other hand, if I was getting 4,000 live viewers right now, I would see, that viewership as providing evidence for why I'm doing a special show. So usually the more people feel compelled to, quote their statistics to show that what they're doing is meritorious, right? We're talking the more insecure people are. So just because 8 billion people have watched a PragerU video does not mean that PragerU videos are good or bad, right? Most PragerU videos are simply bought, right? You buy advertising that auto-plays PragerU videos, and thus you can vastly inflate the number of views. But number of views does not correlate with excellence, moral or intellectual. People's belief systems are core reasons to their actions. No, I don't think there's much evidence for that. People's core reasons for their actions are primarily from their genetics and from the incentives that their tribe provides. Their beliefs are just a fairly weak, rational, cognitive overlay to the choices that they take that are in their self-interests. So you argue that people's belief systems have led to the most horrific chapters of history, and this is not normal or healthy. I would argue that people's genetic kinship, that blood essentially has led to most slaughters in history. You don't tend to find the same subspecies living in harmony in a particular place in nature. Usually what happens is one subspecies drives out another subspecies. And if you look at the different groups of human beings as subspecies, right, you can understand why often one group has, frankly, and often just driven out other groups. So let's get some lighter fare.
G'day mate, Luke Ford here. Just out on a walk around downtown Beverly Hills, and I realised that the weather today, it's a cool 65 degrees, and overcast. But usually when I take these walks, it's 90 degrees and sunny. And so I was thinking, well, it's not such a good day today. But then I got thinking, well, what does a good day even mean? Yeah, well, it's entirely dependent on the situation, isn't it? It's entirely dependent on how I feel on the day. One day, I might wake up and want it to be 90 degrees and sunny, and the next, I might think that 60 degrees and rainy is a good day. It's entirely dependent on the situation. So there really are no good or bad days at all. And this is the same with people too. I mean, on one extreme, you could have a type of person who is violent and murderous, and on the other, you could have a person who's a upstanding citizen with a good credit score, who you like to invite over for Shabbat dinner. But then that gets you thinking, well, what even is murderousness? What even is a good credit score? It's entirely dependent, really, on how you look at it, isn't it? One man's murderousness could be another man's upstandingness. It's entirely dependent on how you look at it. It's 50% of one and half of the other. So we really can't ever kind of nail anything down at all, and we're always kind of lost in this fence-sitting, middle of the road nothingness.
Okay, that's a really good, funny critique by Stephen J. James. Luke, your voice is so much more fit and manly. What happened? Stephen do Ramsey Paul. Luke Ford is what they play to prisoners in CIA black sites. So I hope that I'm not so repetitive and so predictable and so lacking in value as that video intimates. But I got to tip my yarmulke to Stephen James. That was a very good takedown. Painful. Here's a little more John Mearsheimer.
Indeed, I think the United States would like to see the Israelis win, whatever that means, in Gaza, end that war, so that we have a stable Middle East. That's the American goal. No escalation. The Israelis are a different matter. First point I would make there is I actually believe the Israelis wouldn't mind a general conflagration because that would facilitate ethnic cleansing. I think the Israelis are interested in cleansing not only Gaza, where they've made their views manifestly clear in recent months, but I think they're also interested in cleansing the West Bank. And a general conflagration would make it easier for them to do it. I'm not saying they could succeed at cleansing both places, but it would make it easier. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people who in Israel who want escalation for that reason. I think the other reason they want escalation, which I have no doubt about, is that they have a huge problem on their northern border, the border with Hezbollah. Most accounts say that there are about 200,000 Israelis who have been displaced from their homes, either in northern Israel or in southern Israel. And of course, it's the Gaza conflict in southern Israel that explains what's going on there. So let's say there are 100,000 people from southern Israel who have been displaced by the Gaza conflict. There are another 100,000 who have been displaced by what's going on in the north. And this is a huge problem for the Israelis. And the question is, how do they move those people back to northern Israel until the conflict with Hamas, until the conflict with Hezbollah is settled and Hezbollah stops firing rockets, missile, and artillery rounds into northern Israel? Well, as long as the war in Gaza goes on, I believe the Hezbollah will continue to target northern Israel. Again, because of what's going on in Gaza. So what the Israelis would like to do is they would like to use military force. They'd like to escalate. They think they have escalation domination here, or escalation dominance here. I think they'd like to escalate against Hezbollah, inflict massive punishment on not only Hezbollah, but Lebanon more generally, and work out some sort of modus vivendi with Hezbollah that allows them to move those 100,000 or so Israelis back to northern Israel. So I think that's what's going on. And I think it's a very dangerous situation. I think the Americans understand that. And given that the Americans don't want escalation, I think this is why they're putting great pressure on Israel not to escalate the war against Hezbollah.
Do you think there's any value to the...
Okay, when you overstate your case, all right, you lose credibility. And Iran may have overstated its case in launching these missiles and drones at Israel, all right? You make a case not just through words, but also through actions. So thinking about Sam Vaknin's analysis, which I played earlier, and thinking about entities overstating their case. So think about Donald Trump's trajectory over the past 15 months. So 15 months ago, Donald Trump appeared irrelevant. Now he is the most likely candidate to win the presidency of the United States. What happened? Well, about 13 months ago, there was the beginning of a plethora of Democrat-led criminal charges against Donald Trump. And as a backlash to these criminal prosecutions against Trump, right, he's become more relevant. On the other hand, when Trump was elected in 2016, his opponents did a far better job of organizing against him than did his supporters. So Trump's 4 years in office saw limited progress toward his goals and little widespread popularity. So Trump, during his 4 years in office, he consistently mobilized more opposition than support, and voters turned against him in 2018 and 2020. In particular, there was the devastating 2% swing against him in the suburbs. If he wins in 2024, or it will be because he reversed this 2% swing against him in the suburbs. Now, when you're at war, either literally, in a fighting war or in a political or cultural or religious war, you need to act and to speak so that you consistently mobilize more support than opposition. You are saying and doing things that mobilize more opposition than support, you're going in a losing trajectory. So this usually requires keeping your instincts in check and to continually ask, what will do good as opposed to what will feel good? What will be the repercussions of what I'm saying and doing? So you don't want to live a life without a strong in-group identity, yet these sort of ties both bind you to other people and blind you. So it's good, even while enjoying a strong in-group identity, to keep one foot out of the in-group and ask yourself, how is what we're saying and doing in my in-group, how is this going to be perceived by disinterested observers? So I'm sure that Iran's attack on Saturday against Israel felt good to Iran and its supporters. I'm sure that the Democrat-led criminal prosecutions of Trump over the past year have felt good to Democrats, but did either of these attacks succeed in their purposes? Now, I don't think so, but situations change, and so what looks like a bad decision today may well be vindicated by tomorrow. Right, there's my wishy-washiness that Stephen James so ably mocked. So to economize on decision-making, most people, even in the most individualist of countries, tend to treat other people primarily not as individuals, but as members of groups. There was an Israeli professor back in July of 2014 who got in great trouble because he said the only thing that can deter terrorists, like those who kidnapped these 3 Israeli children and killed them, is the knowledge that their sister or their mother will be raped. It sounds very bad, but that's the Middle East. This is Dr. Mordechai Kedar at Bar Ilan University, which is an Orthodox Jewish university outside of Tel Aviv. So he says that would-be suicide bombers would only be stopped if their female relatives were raped. Now, Dr. Kedar said he was not suggesting this tactic, but he said that the knowledge that their sister or their mother would be raped was the only thing that would stop terrorists from attacking Israel. We can't take these steps, he said. I'm not talking about what we should or should not do. I'm talking about the facts. The only thing that deters a suicide bomber is the knowledge that if he pulls the trigger or blows himself up, his sister will be raped. That's all. That's the only thing that will bring him back home to preserve his sister's honor. So it's worth asking what's right and wrong. It's also worth asking, how does the world work and what will work? So legal systems, whether religious or secular, describe how the world should work, but they don't necessarily describe how the world actually works. Right? You rip off a serious criminal, you rip off the mafia or a drug dealing gang, right? They're likely not only to hurt you, but they'll also go after everyone you love and your family. Why? Because this tactic works to deter people from messing with you. So many things sound great, like democracy and individualism, but most of life runs along authoritarian and corporate lines. Right, here's a lighter note. Have you heard of Dr. K? He's someone, I think he often talks about how he's a psychiatrist at Harvard, and YouTube keeps feeding me Dr. K videos, and I have not found they are worth their time. Here is a disturbing moment in a video that he did with his wife, right? Dr. K and Mrs. K give relationship advice.
Incredibly emotionally intelligent and also very on top of her responsibilities and habits.
Okay, so this is someone giving a question about his girlfriend.
Is someone who is behind in these regards. How can I feel less like the weak link in our relationship? I'm working on developing these traits, but in the meantime, I feel like I'm dragging the relationship down despite her telling me that I'm doing fine as long as I'm still working on myself.
Don't compare yourself to each other. That's a bad way to go.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I agree, right? So like Kruti and I had a similar period where she was like earning and a functional human being, and I was like struggling to get into medical school. And I think that okay.
I knew you were going to be there.
Yeah. So, but I think that so that's what you know, right? And that's exactly what his girlfriend is telling him, right? So you're saying basically this sentence. I feel like I'm dragging the relationship down despite her telling me that I'm doing fine as long as I'm working on myself.
Listen to her.
Yeah. So I think the perspective, this person is asking for my perspective because I've been closer to that situation than you have.
Tell him to listen to her.
No, I mean, that's not sufficient.
Go ahead.
So I'm a little bit concerned with how disrespectful you are to me on stream.
Okay.
What do you think about that? I'm serious.
Okay.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Tell me more.
So, like, when you say go ahead, it implies that you're giving me permission to speak.
Oh, that's because we were both talking, and then I was saying, you can talk. Like,
you can talk.
Right, and I will stop talking.
So when you say, like, you can talk, that implies permission.
What should I say?
I think maybe you should, I think it should be a little bit more, like if I'm speaking, you should ask me if you want to interrupt to begin with.
Okay.
Right? Instead of just, got me?
I got you.
We good?
We're good.
Okay. So.
Talk about cringe. I hate it when people use therapy speak to wage emotional war on each other. He like reprimands her for interrupting him, but then she quite rightly asks him, what would you like me to do? And then he comes back with, after not being able to find anything, oh, you should ask me for permission to speak. Hey, why is YouTube pushing this guy? It just gives me the absolute creeps. Right, here's someone who doesn't give me the creeps. So I mean, can you imagine speaking that way to your wife on a live stream or just in public? It's so awkward for me. This happens way too much in Orthodox Jewish life. Like wives just berating their husbands around a Shabbat table or a Passover table. I've only once seen in Jewish life a husband publicly berate his wife in front of guests. This was at a Passover, and the poor harried wife was just exhausted and beaten down. And then the husband starts going after her. It was just so awkward. But I've probably seen it 20 different occasions in Orthodox life where the wife just starts demeaning and denigrating her husband in front of guests. To me, that's absolute nightmare. I've only occasionally had a girlfriend who would deliberately, intentionally demean and denigrate me publicly. It did not feel good.
Where essentially, if you're telling yourself the story, people will only accept me or like me or want to be close to me if I am showing up perfectly. That thought process can actually become a vicious cycle where it starts feeling more and more as though that thing is the truth, but it's not. And then in the latter half of the video, we're going to go over what it looks like to have a really strong sense of internal perfectionism. So this idea that I will not accept me unless and until I am perfect, and how that belief tends to keep us away from having really meaningful and deeply fulfilling lives. So we're going to go over how to break both of these patterns and challenge our own thinking in these areas in order to get ourselves more of what we want out of our lives and less of what we don't want. And you might have both of the beliefs we're going to talk about today. You may have only one or the other, but I think it's highly likely that even if there's one you initially recognize yourself in, you probably have some element of the other as well. So I encourage you to watch both halves of this video just to see which one resonates a little bit more, or if these two are actually heavily impacting each other. So we're going to start.
Okay, that's Heidi Prieb. She's an attachment expert. I like her YouTube videos. She gave the best explanation that I found yet on what allows someone to exhibit good energy, right? When we say someone's got good energy, what exactly do we mean? But before I continue on that theme, I read a terrific column by probably the most prestigious columnist right now and for the past 5 years. It's Janan Ganesh, someone of Sri Lankan background. He writes for the Financial Times, which is out of London. And here he's writing about the myth of second chance. So it's very American, this idea that that we can overcome our mistakes. So he says the self-help industry suggests all mistakes in life are retrievable. Middle age teaches us otherwise. So I believe he is more right than wrong here. So in the novels of Ian McEwan, so I probably read 6, 8 novels by Ian McEwan, but there is a pattern in his novels. The main character makes one mistake, which then hangs over them forever. And I think this is true to life. Right? A girl misidentifies a rapist, and in doing so, she shatters 3 lives, including her own. Right? That's his novel Atonement, which was made into a movie. A man exchanges a lingering glance with another man, who then becomes a tenacious stalker, enduring love. Right? Bringing people into your life is so dangerous. A just married couple fail to have sex, or rather have it very badly, and aren't themselves again, either as individuals or as a pair. That's on Chesil Beach. So these mistakes reverberate over much of the 20th century in novels of Ian McEwan, and I think this is true to life. Right? This plot trick is said to be unbecoming of a serious artist. Ian McEwan is accused of an obsession with incident that isn't true to the gradualism and untidiness of real life. So whereas Marcel Proust luxuriates in the slow accretion of human experience, McEwan homes in on the singular event. It is too neat. It is written to be filmed. And Janan Ganesh, who's in his 40s, says, I'm old enough now to observe peers in the middle years, including some disappointed and hurt ones. I suggest it is Ian McEwan who gets life right. The surprise of middle age and the terror of it is how much of a person's fate can boil down to one misjudgment. My life was crippled by one primary mistake. I carried on the vegetarianism that I inherited from my parents, and in so doing, I sentenced myself to a life of ill health. That more than any other mistake, that one mistake, that as a teen I did not rebel against my parents' vegetarianism, while my brother and sister did. right? That has devastated my life. I never sought help or got help for ADHD. That devastated my life. I could have been diagnosed with ADHD as a child. I would have been able to employ my attention like a normal person and achieve a normal life. That was devastating for my life. I got hooked on sexual promiscuity at age 27, and that diminished my chances of settling down, getting married, and having children. I did not address my underlying emotional addictions until I got into my 40s and 50s. These underlying emotional addictions crippled my life, both in terms of earning, in terms of relationships, in terms of self-respect. So those are just absolutely devastating mistakes that reverberated. Then in 1995, I decided to write a book on the sex industry. And so I've forever tarnished myself as the porn guy. And I spent approximately a decade writing a great deal about the sex industry, made most of my income for that decade writing about the sex industry, and forever diminished my possibilities, my chances, my self-respect in life by immersing myself in that filth. So I think Ian McEwan is right. One mistake, particularly when you choose to prolong it, whether it's a vegetarian diet or writing about the pornography industry, not getting help for your emotional addictions, not getting help for your ADHD, right? Despite anything else you do, right, your life will be wrecked by these mistakes. So back to this Chazon Ish column. What in particular should the young know? If you marry badly or marry at all when it isn't right for you, don't assume that the damage is recoverable, right? Particularly for women, if you make a poor marital choice in your 20s, it's very hard to rebound from that later. You make the wrong career choice and you realize it as early as age 30, don't count on a way back. Right? If you go down a science track at school when the humanities are really your thing, that can absolutely mangle your life. When I started seriously studying economics, it destroyed my ability to appreciate poetry. Now, none of these errors need consign a person to eternal and acute distress, but life is path dependent. Each mistake narrows the next round of choices. A big one or just an early one can foreclose all hope of the life that you wanted. By carrying on a vegetarian diet, I foreclosed all hope of the life I wanted. By not addressing my ADHD for many decades, not addressing my emotional addictions, I foreclosed all hope of the life I wanted, no matter what else I did. There was no religious solution to the physiological problem of ADHD. There was no religious solution to the emotional addiction problem of having an emotional addiction. There was no religious solution to the devastating ill effect that my vegetarian diet had on my strength and my health. There should be more candor about this from the people who are looked to or paid for guidance. The rise of the advice industrial complex, the self-help podcast, the chief executive coaches, the men's conferences have been mostly benign. Much of the content is American. It reflects the optimism of America. The notion of an unsalvageable mistake is almost transgressive in America, the land of second chances, but it is much more resonant in countries like England and Australia. For obvious commercial reasons, the audience has to be told that all is not lost. The life is still theirs to shape deep into adulthood. Right? No one's going to sign up to the Chazon Ish motivational boot camp. You had kids without thinking it through, it's over, son. No matter how radiant the speaker. A mistake in the modern telling is not a mistake. It's a chance to grow, to develop resilience. It's merely a bridge toward ultimate success. And in some cases, yes, but a person's life at 40 isn't the sum of most decisions. It is skewed by a disproportionately important few decisions, some professional, some romantic. Get these decisions wrong, and the scope for retrieving the situation is, if not zero, frequently it is zero, then it is tiny. And American culture in particular struggles to impart this bad news. Martin Amos, right, a peer of Ian McEwan, once attempted to explain the vast international appeal of soccer. He says it's the only sport that is frequently decided by one goal. So the pressure on the moment is more intense in football than any other sport. Right? A team may hog the ball in soccer, create superior chances, win more duels, get more corner kicks, more shots on goal, and still lose the game due to one error. That's why statisticians call soccer the stupid sport, but it also is the one sport that perhaps most approximates life outside the stadium. When I look around at the distress and regret of my peers, I feel sympathy, but also amazement at the casualness with which people enter into big life choices. Perhaps this is what happens when ideas of redemption and resurrection, the ultimate second chance, simply encoded into the historic faith of a culture. It takes a more profane cast of mind to see through this delusion. Right? This is why I spend $180 a year subscribing to the Financial Times.
Start with the interpersonal side of things. So this belief that I will only be accepted if I am perfect. So let's look at what happens when we go into a situation believing that this is the truth, that we will be rejected if we show any sign of weakness or imperfection in front of other people. So when we live with this belief, essentially the question we are asking ourselves in every scenario we enter into is, am I able to show up perfectly here? And if the answer is yes, in the rare scenario where, let's say, we believe that we have truly mastered a skill or worked so hard at it.
So I did not intend to live stream today. I did not intend to write about Iran's direct attack on Israel. I intended to just immerse myself in this video by Heidi Priebe and note down my reactions.
That we now feel relaxed when we are performing it. What happens is we give off a very easeful and congruent energy because we're not freaking out and trying to hide ourselves or trying to shield other people from seeing our true selves. We are going into a situation wanting to be seen because we believe that we have achieved perfection, or at the least something so close to perfection that whatever tiny mistake.
But it's hard for good things to develop in your life if you don't welcome being seen. Right? If you need to hide what you do for a living, right, that's going to cripple you.
Mistakes we make, we believe others will forgive us for. So we show up to those situations with presence and dignity.
So people with a lot of body armoring, meaning unnecessary layers of tension and compression, they're pulled down, they've got weird interfering tension patterns in their shoulders, in their back, on their face, around their lips, around their eyes, in their forehead. Right? These are not people who tend to show up with presence and dignity. Right? Whatever's going on in your body is going to have a profound effect on your thinking and your emotions. And the more body armoring you have, the more layers of unnecessary tension you have, the more stilted you will come across. And the less likely it is that you will give off good energy, and the more likely it is that people will feel uncomfortable around you. On the other hand, what creates all this unnecessary tension and compression, right? It's primarily two thought patterns, suggested one Alexander teacher, I've forgotten who. One thought pattern is, I've got too much to do and not enough time to do it. And the other thought pattern is, I've got to be perfect. Right? These patterns of thinking create all sorts of layers of unnecessary tension and compression, leading to reduced performance, reduced happiness, reduced health, reduced ease with oneself and with others.
And anytime we are showing up to a situation with presence and dignity, we are naturally giving off an energy that makes others comfortable because we're essentially communicating to them through the way that we're behaving. Hey, I'm okay. You don't have to worry about me. You don't have to provide me with self-esteem. I'm not trying to get anything out of you.
So the opposite of good energy is coming across as needy, when people feel like you want something from them.
I feel secure in how I am. And so you can just be you and I'll just be me. So showing up with that energy puts the people around you at ease. And when the people around us are at ease, they tend to respond quite favorably to us. And that brings you right back into that belief, I must be perfect to be liked. Because look at what happened when you went into something perfectly. People responded favorably to you. And of course, if you could do everything perfectly all of the time, this belief would be no problem. However, even the most perfectionistic people amongst us usually only feel like they're getting things perfectly right an incredibly small proportion of the time. So what happens the other 99.99% of the time in your life? What happens when you go into a situation and you ask yourself the question, can I do this perfectly? And the answer is no. Now you're probably going to pick one of two options. One is to retreat, so to go home, to withdraw, to isolate, and to keep trying to perfect that skill before you.
So I converted to Judaism ostensibly, rationally, cognitively. What was driving me is that I was convinced of the beauties and the necessity and the profundity of ethical monotheism, that there's one God who makes one primary moral demand on humanity, and that is that we are good and kind to each other. And I saw Judaism as embodying ethical monotheism. Now, Judaism contains ethical monotheism, but I just don't think it's fair to say that Judaism is primarily about ethical monotheism, or that Stephen J. James is in the house. Stephen J., do you have time and inclination to stop by the show? I'll send you an invite if you do. I loved your video where you are taking on my mannerisms and the habitual things that I say. I mean, you have to get some outside perspectives, because a lot of time I set up do a live stream, and at the end of it, I realized I've contributed nothing. That was a waste of my time. It was a waste of other people's time. So, Stephen J. James, I'm going to send you an invite via Twitter DM. Hang on a minute.
You go back into a situation where you need to attempt to use it. Or if you can't avoid the situation, isolation and withdrawal is not an option, you might go into the situation with defensive and guarded energy. So you have that belief that if anybody sees the fact that I'm not currently perfect at this thing, they're going to judge me and they're going to reject me. So I need to be on high alert. I need to kind of push away any questions people have that might expose me as imperfect if I were to answer them honestly. And I need to find a way to throw people off the trail so that they don't see that I'm not perfect at this thing. Or we might just show up feeling super bad about ourselves and have this energy to us that we really need other people's validation, that it's okay to be where we are. But in any case, we're going to be showing up with really incongruent energy, where we're feeling one way but trying to act a different way. And when we're showing up with incongruent energy, other people tend to pick up on that. Even if they can't put a finger on why, they usually know there's something about the way that this person is holding themselves and the words that they're saying, or the kind of energy that they're giving off and the words that they're saying, that don't quite match up. When we have that incongruent, mismatched energy, it tends to make people feel uncomfortable in our presence.
And let's welcome Stephen J. James back to the show. Stephen, how's it going, mate?
Hey, Luke. How's my audio?
It's great.
Fantastic. So, yeah, I don't have long. I heard you watched the little video I did. Sorry about that.
I loved it. It was great. I mean, you really took the Mickey out of me, and I think you absolutely nailed it.
Well, that's very kind. So I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes.
Yeah, good. I knew you'd be a sport.
So yeah. Okay. I mean, you've got. How would you describe your gift for mimicry, or for kind of capturing the essence of someone?
Very poor, actually. To be honest, I don't think I'm a natural mimic. I've tried to do some impressions lately, and like some people you can do, but I don't think I have a gift for it at all. So, yeah. Yours wasn't an impression, like voice-wise, though. Yours was just getting the essence of sometimes how you do this attempt to evaluate both sides of an argument and be fair dealing, I think is what I was trying to get at, Luke. That you can over-egg that effort to give fair dealing to both sides to the extent at which you end up maybe sometimes having like not pinned anything down. What would you say to that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Often I'll do a live stream, and then when it finishes, it was not what I intended, and I have the sense I've contributed nothing. I have wasted my time, my energy.
I know that feeling well. Yeah.
And other people's time, and I haven't moved the ball, down the field. I've just, run around in circles.
So let me give you some pushback then on what you're talking about today. To what extent do you think you're doing that today? And to what extent do you think that maybe you're actually here just like giving some kind of weak source, maybe even like Hasbro style cope defense of Israel, and kind of struggling to do it, but feeling the need to do it?
I don't consciously feel any need to do Hasbara, make the case for Israel. So after
you would have implicit biases like we all do. It's your team. This is how you're going to approach it, like anybody, I imagine. So it's talk me through that. What do you think?
Yeah. So I don't do that. So I don't do that consciously. So for example, I'm very happy to have History Speaks and Jonathan Otto Paul on the show, neither of whom are fans of the Jewish state. And it's effortless for me to have people like that on the show making strident critiques of Israel, and my blood pressure doesn't rise. I'm unbothered by it. So I think I do relatively little Hasbara. To me, the essence of your critique is that sometimes I'm just not adding any value. So it's not so much on the one hand this, on the other hand that. That's ostensibly what I'm doing, but underneath that is I'm just not adding any value. So that's what I took away from your video. So prior to doing this stream, it was really important to me to try to add value, that I might contribute something to understanding these issues that is not part of the dominant discourse about them. I don't want to just surf the discourse and give reactions like most live streamers. I want to go under the discourse and try to get to the principles that reveal the subterranean territory of which the discourse is just like the tip of the iceberg. Does that make any sense?
It does. I think sometimes though you can want to do that so much that, like you said, you can effectively say nothing. It's a weird conundrum. I get it. Let me then again give some pushback. Probably not in my interest to do it, and I'd also say, by the way, for what it's worth, I will condemn Iran's response, just for anybody that's out there, and I am somewhat sympathetic to Israel's position of that they're living with some shit people that they have a problem with, and it's a nightmare situation. What the hell do we do with it, and all this? But to me, it seems that at each step of what they've been doing since October the 7th has been putting one foot wrong after the other, looking more and more like a basket case, inflaming each situation, turning sentiment against them all around the world. They've caused incredible international problems, whether it's justified or not what they're doing. The outcome is with international shipping and all the trouble with Yemen, now with Iran, and which it is either way that you look at it, a direct response to them blowing up that consulate in Syria, whether it's justified or not. Each situation is becoming an escalation, and it's looking more and more like a basket case out there, and harder and harder to paint them as just a rational actors doing what anybody would do. How would you take that?
Well, I would say that position gets more time on my show since October 7th than any other position of looking at what's happening. The person that I play the most on these issues is John Mearsheimer, who articulates exactly what you just said. And then probably the people I play second most, people like on the Duran podcast, Alexander Mercouris, and I played some Glenn Greenwald, and I'd say that's the dominant position that is articulated and argued for on this show. Even though I don't hold by it, I think it's a credible, well argued position. So, do you think I'm delusional? I have not primarily made that argument, but the content on my show has been more in alignment with what you just said than not. Do you think that's accurate?
Probably, yeah. Actually, I have to admit to zoning out whenever you play Mearsheimer or the Duran. I've got to be honest. So I'm probably not paying attention much, but you're probably playing those as like an antidote to, I think, your instincts, which that
yes,
Israel is being like a rational actor, doing the best that it can in a bad situation, perhaps, and then you'll play these other people who give an alternative perspective. Is that what you feel you're doing?
I think so. I can't even think of any pro-Israel people. Aside from Nathan Kofnas, I had Kofnas on my stream, but aside from that, I can't think of any pro-Israel people I've had on my stream. Compared to History Speaks, who's been on my show probably 5 times, Otto Pohl has been on my show probably 50 times, and these are all anti-Israel people. So when it comes to guest selection, I would say it probably runs in the ratio of probably 10 to 1.
Oh, sure.
Against Israel.
Absolutely. Oh, the Luke Ford show, in terms of guests, certainly has been, yeah. I'm on about your perspective. I did see that you tweet out, I know this is like just quotes from your show or something, but the case that Israel is doing a great job minimizing civilian casualties in Gaza. And I saw that and I was like, what the heck? I mean, do you think they're doing a great job at minimizing civilian casualties?
I didn't until I read that particular article, which is found in the link to that. So I didn't think that.
Okay. No,
I thought
right.
I would argue with my Jewish friends that Israel's invasion of Gaza has been a disaster. Then I changed my mind when I thought about, well, what other country would put up with having rockets and missiles fired at it, as Hamas has done from Gaza. So when I thought about that, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, no normal country would put up with that. Every single country that had the capability would go in and destroy any entity that's firing missiles at it. And so I would prefer to look at Israel and its behavior against any other country. Yeah. But then that particular article in the Wall Street Journal blew my mind, because I was convinced that Israel was being reckless with civilian lives, but it wasn't a major personal concern for me, because I think any nation, when it feels threatened for its survival, is just going to lash out and is not going to care about civilian deaths. But then this one article in the Wall Street Journal made the argument that 9 civilian deaths to every 1 militant death is the norm in this type of urban fighting, and that Israel has managed to keep the ratio to about 1.5 to 2 to 1. And if that is accurate, right, it's accurate that Israel has, say, kept the number of civilian deaths under 2 for every militant that it kills, and if it's accurate that the norm in urban warfare is 9 civilian deaths for every militant killed, then by that standard, Israel's done an extraordinary job. Now, I'm not an expert in urban warfare, so both of those bases may be wrong. I just haven't seen any evidence yet that they're wrong. If I do see evidence that they're wrong, I will come out and say it.
Yeah, wow. On those numbers, I guess like every second person in Gaza would have to be a militant or something, though, wouldn't they, with the amount that's died?
No, I said if it's less than 2 to 1. So right now, the number is 33,000 dead Gazans. So if 12,000 of those are militants and the rest are civilians, that is a ratio of fewer than 2 dead civilians for every dead militant.
Well, the numbers might back you up on that. Who knows? The perception, however, around the world is obviously very different, isn't it? And I mean, this is the only issue. This is really like where my critique lies. And again, I'm no geopolitical guy, Luke. As we all know, I'm not here giving some sophisticated political analysis. I'm just saying that, well, what am I saying actually? Since October the 7th, Israel seems to have not particularly solved the issues. There doesn't seem to yet be any sign of solution to the issues at hand, and they actually seem to have inflamed many others. The Yemen issue, now the Iran issue, Hezbollah in the north or whatever.
Yes.
Things seem to be escalating at every stage rather than being wrapped up. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that. And that's why I talked about that Israel may very well see it's in its own interest to have a conflagration, to have a wider regional war. And this widespread trope in the news media that Israel does not want a regional war, I think is false.
Yeah, I did hear you say that about Bibi, that Bibi in particular probably wants a war. Is that right? Yeah, for his own political survival.
He may, and then Israel may be able to push out Arabs and Palestinians if there's a wider conflagration. I mean, imagine, let's say, Hezbollah launches missiles at Israel that kill over, say, 100,000 Israeli civilians. Israel's response would be absolutely brutal, and they would probably use the conflagration as an opportunity to push Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank to create a greater Israel. And I can see why Israelis would think this would be in their national interest. They would have a more cohesive and united country with fewer vulnerabilities, but probably not in America's best interest, and certainly not in the interests of Palestinians.
No, it is interesting, this response that Iran has just done as well. Do you kind of agree with the takes that I've heard go around that Iran itself doesn't want actually to escalate, but this is done like as a face-saving operation, and they were on the phones beforehand saying, look, we've got to do this because we're obviously in a precarious situation with our own people here. We have to be seen to look tough, otherwise we're at risk of internal revolution, and so we're going to do this, but we don't want anything else. And now it's in Israel's shoes again, the question of whether they're going to escalate it further, and then it's going to become more tit for tat either side. But in a way, Iran had to do this. Again, I condemn it, but it's just face saving for their own sake.
I mean, I spent almost no time or effort on the morality of this conflict. First of all, I'm biased, and I just don't think I have anything to offer. So you don't hear me standing up here and condemning anyone or anything. I just try to embrace and understand reality.
Well, I'm doing it for my own survival here in the United Kingdom, of course.
Right, but I'm not here to condemn or anyone or anything. I'm just trying to understand what's happening. So my initial perspective when I thought about it this morning, I initially thought that Iran is operating in a savvy way, that they are signaling to their friends and their enemies certain things that are in their national interests, right? It's probably in Iran's national interest to make America's presence in the Middle East as expensive as possible. And by sending $1,000 drones that require multi-million-dollar missiles to shoot down, that they are winning these, they won yesterday's battle, right? Israel had to spend, over $100 million to defeat arms that may have cost Iran $5 million. Then I heard a contrary argument by Sam Vaknin, who's very much on Israel's left, that made the argument that Iran made a massive mistake. So I was about to do the show talking about Iran's savvy operation of its foreign policy in alignment with its own best interests. And then I heard Sam Vaknin, and I was, let me pull back from that. I think Sam Vaknin's making some good points. So I actually have no idea right now whether the attack on Saturday by Iran was more in Iran's interests or more in Israel's interests. I just don't know, completely unsure.
Yeah. And like I say, I'm no geopolitical analyst, and I think that they're all basket cases in this area. So I wouldn't say it's in their national interest either. And it does seem to make sense, the thesis that a country like Iran, that we saw just was it a year and a half ago that there were the protests on the ground internally in Iran. It must be the case that a country like that is under threat from internal revolution at any point, at any time. The thing that they fear the most is a colour revolution of their own. And so it's always the worry that they look like a weak regime to their own internal threats more than anything. And so some things they just have to do. And this was like the attack by their mortal enemy Israel on an Iranian consulate in a foreign country, killing some of their top generals. From what I've read, other people say they had to respond. But it seems that in the background what they've done is be on the phone to the United States, maybe even Israel, who knows, I doubt it, and say, look, we're doing this X, Y, and Z operation. Please let everybody know that this will then, be the end of it if we don't get another response. So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. And I began the show with an analogy, which I think you might appreciate, and that is Iran's attack was the equivalent of driving alone in a car down the street wearing a face mask. It's signal.
A virtue signal.
It's virtue signaling.
Okay.
But then I make the argument that virtue signaling is virtuous because throughout nature, plants and animals are constantly signaling. Human beings are constantly signaling. And so sending signals, I think, is important. So I don't agree with the right-wing approach that virtue signaling is stupid or bad. I think sending signals is usually a highly worthy thing to do. So if Iran's attack was purely virtue signaling, to me, that does not diminish the utility of it.
It's a funny way to put it, but I suppose it's a very Arab way to signal as well, isn't it? To throw bombs. So, it could be looked at in that way. Look, I don't know what's going on in the situation. It just seems escalation at every point. So, anyway, Luke, I've got to run. So it was good to pop on again. I hope I added some value and gave you some pushback for the show.
Yeah. Thank you. Great to talk to you. And I sent a link to...
Thank you for having me. See you later.
Yeah, take care, bro.
See you. Bye.
Send a link to Curious Gazelle. Like to get her on the show, so send it to you via DM. So let me catch my breath here, play a little Heidi Preeb until we get Curious on.
Uncomfortable in our presence, we tend to have a harder time connecting with them. Because if we're being inauthentic, it's hard to authentically connect with someone else. What happens is, once again, it goes right back into reinforcing that belief that I need to be perfect in order to be accepted. Because we are misattributing our lack of acceptance from other people to the fact that we weren't doing something perfectly, as opposed to what it might actually have been, which is that we were not behaving in a way that was congruent and authentic, and that tends to turn people off. Of course, this will not be true in all scenarios, but I find that it is true in so many more scenarios than most of us realize, particularly those of us who err perfectionistic realize. It is unbelievable. Because the thing that most of us don't realize, especially most of us who grew up with more perfectionistic patterning, is that people are not attracted to other people's perfection. If people are attracted to other people's perfection, it's probably just because they are also wounded in a way that leads them to believe that they need to be perfect and they need.
So when I was talking to a friend while walking around Loma Linda University one Shabbat in 2010, I was praising Dennis Prager, and then I found myself saying, I'd like Dennis Prager to be president. I'd like Dennis Prager to run the world. I'd like Dennis Prager to run the universe. So I was exhibiting, I think, what Heidi Preeb here is just talking. The higher I praised Dennis Prager and that I had any sort of connection to the great man, the better I was able to feel about myself. So I ended up saying something just completely embarrassing.
need to be with another person who is perfect in order to be universally admired by people, because that's what they know love to be. But people who actually have more secure patterning and who are more grounded in what feels meaningful in life understand that all humans.
Right. So I noticed that people who are secure, they just have less need for ballast, external ballast, such as trying to employ religion to hold themselves up, or workaholism to hold themselves up, or extreme devotion to a sports fan. Right? The people who are secure seem less likely to engage in the extreme devotions and activities and commitments that mark people who aren't secure. I mean, people who paint themselves up in the colors of their favorite sports team and go to a sporting stadium where the temperature is below zero and they're just there in shorts to show how extreme their devotion is, right? Do you think that such extreme sports fans are basically healthy, well-adjusted, productive citizens? No, it's obviously a cope for not having a life that works and then trying to create some external group that you wish to dissolve yourself into to create some kind of ballast and meaning and purpose to your life, because you're so incredibly passive in your own life and taking the steps you need to take to build a worthy life that you become so hyper aggressive, perhaps in your online life or in your sporting or religious devotion.
Humans are imperfect, including themselves. So, people who are able to display their vulnerabilities and the things that they're struggling with, and who can signal the areas in which they need help, as well as can stand strong in the areas where they do have natural aptitudes, that combination of traits becomes very attractive because it's signaling, hey, I'm human, and so I'm not going to expect you to be not human. And we can co-regulate around both our strengths and our weaknesses. So we're going to take a look.
If only the leaders of Israel and Iran had been listening to Heidi Priebe, maybe we would have avoided this, nasty conflict. I just imagine they were able to bond over their common humanity and to have empathy for the other's frailties.
Look at that cycle we just did with perfectionism, and we're going to run it through a more secure belief system. So if we have that belief that others are attracted to my presence and my humanity, so my authenticity, now what happens when we go into a situation and ask ourselves the question, can I do this?
So when people demonstrate this kind of authenticity, this is what we call someone with good energy.
Perfectly, is that it's a much simpler cycle.
And it's a lot easier to get to your authenticity if you are not pulled down by unnecessary tension and compression, right? If you haven't taken on all these weird tension patterns that play across your face when you're talking or when you're dealing with a stimulus, right? When you get a stimulus, how do you react? You react in an adaptive or a maladaptive fashion. So the more body armoring you get, the more weird and unnecessary tension and compression patterns, the more you kind of pull down, the more you exhibit fight or flight reflexes where your head is jutting out and your shoulders are rising up and maybe one shoulder is higher than the other and your hips are out of alignment with your back and your head, so that the weight of your head is putting all sorts of unnecessary tension and pressure on your neck and on your back and on your hips, right? The more of that kind of body armoring you build up, right, the less you're able to come across in an authentic and easy way that then inspires other people to want to get close to you. I remember I was at this Orthodox Jewish singles Shabbat lunch, and we were all sitting in a circle. We're all introducing ourselves to each other, and we were telling each other, we were supposed to share one thing about us. And I shared with the group that I really love sarcasm and irony. And my therapist said to me, that'll really make people want to get close to you. So welcome, Curious Gazelle. Anything that you've heard today that you want to comment on?
Hi. I've not really been watching, actually. I just sort of watched the last 10 minutes of your show where you had that guy on. I don't know his name.
Stephen James.
Stephen James, that's it. SJJ, is that it? Is that his initials?
Yeah. SJJ. So is there anything
Yeah.
that he said that caught your attention?
No, because I wasn't being very attentive actually, and but you were saying something about virtue signaling and how you think it's a good thing
Yes.
to signal virtue because
Yes.
and you argued via analogy there that even plants signal and so what do you think about the argument from analogy in general?
I think argument from analogy is not usually the best way to go. All right. If you have stronger arguments, you should use stronger arguments. So argument from analogy is not ideal. It's incredibly open to abuse. Only occasionally, I think, are arguments from analogy powerful. But if argument from analogy follows stronger arguments and is like the icing on the cake, and can provide a feeling or a picture that helps to convey a stronger argument, then it can be worthy. So if animals are engaged in signaling, and I may have overstated the case when I think sometimes plant life signals, but if animals are engaged in signaling, I think that's a pretty good indication that signaling is often adaptive to a situation. And all things considered, it's better to adapt to situations than to engage in maladaptive behavior.
So, I mean, what does Judaism say about analogy? Because there are quite a few. I mean, as you know, I'm not a practicing Muslim, and I have a lot of doubts about the Islamic faith, but I do read the Quran from time to time, and there are lots of references to analogy, and it's almost like it's God who has the right to present an analogy. So, is there anything in Judaism in the Jewish texts which refers to analogy?
Reasoning by analogy is absolutely integral to the way Judaism operates. So what happens is that rabbis or communal leaders find themselves in new situations, and they need to try to corral or redirect the people's behavior. And so there's nothing explicitly in the tradition or to what they can ascribe to coming from God that deals with this new situation. And so they then use analogies to try to deal with this situation. So, for example, about 2,000 years ago, Jews weren't making loans to other Jews because there's an explicit law in the Torah, you're not allowed to loan at interest. So the rabbis came up with a way around that law by saying, if you lend money at interest to a fellow Jew, you're not really lending money at interest. We'll call it investing in that fellow Jew, and it is permitted to take investments. So that's not a good example of reasoning by analogy. It's not an example at all of reasoning by analogy, but there are 9 basic Jewish hermeneutical principles. So hermeneutics means the science of interpretation. Or, the study of interpretation. So the number one method of interpretation is supposed to be the pshat, which is the plain meaning of the text. But then very quickly, after you move through analogies, and there are all sorts of laws then that try to corral the limits of reasoning by analogy. But what happens is when you're in a desperate enough situation, you'll come up with anything that works. And so when I'm doing a live stream and I don't have a stronger form of argumentation, I'm going to reach for anything that works. And often reasoning by analogy is simply easier. And if you can't make a stronger case, you use
analogies just cope then a lot of the time, isn't it? Because it's not really a pure. It's not really an argument from pure reason, because you need intrinsic argumentation going on there, whereas analogy is just something extrinsic, right? It's like a rhetorical device in most cases. What do you think?
Yes, and it's
Which
incredibly
works.
abused. Yeah, it works because it feels good. Right? It feels like someone's made a strong argument. So here's an example: Dennis Prager and almost any guru, Jordan Peterson.
Okay, wait. Before you go into Dennis Prager, if I could just return to 1 second, I can just return to Judaism and analogy. So, I mean, you were presenting basically innovations that Jewish scholars, etc., had sort of done. So they were arguing via analogy to innovate within the religion, right?
Yes.
However, my question is, are there any particular references to analogy in
Judaism? And there
sorry,
are.
someone was just in my room. Yeah, so in the actual texts.
Yeah, there are, and I can't immediately. Well, here's an example. Tell me if this is an example that makes sense. So there's a statement in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, that says you should follow the leaders of your community. And so rabbis have used that to say, we are the leaders of the community, and therefore you should follow us. So the station of rabbi did not develop until about 2,200 years ago, and the Torah is somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 years old, and so the Torah doesn't say anything explicitly about following the rabbis, because rabbis were unknown at the time of the construction of the Torah. But rabbis then seize upon this verse saying, follow the leaders of your community, and apply it to themselves and say, we are the leaders of the community, therefore Jews need to follow us. Not a very good example of analogy, is it?
No, that's quite good. It's in between what I was asking and what you first sort of presented. So it's in between sort of an innovative belief that people have interpreted for themselves and then also what's in the text. But I'm still looking for like direct references to analogy in the Torah. Do you read the Talmud, by the way?
I've studied the Talmud, and I'm not. I'm doing a really bad job of coming up with analogies, but it's absolutely integral. So there's a concept called Kal V'chomer, and it's a reasoning by analogy is basically lenient and strict. So if a case that is generally strict has a particular leniency, a case that is generally lenient will certainly have that leniency. So the argument can also work in reverse, where lenient and strict might not be precisely applicable. So if there's an argument for a defendant that he ought to be believed regarding a certain claim because he could have made a different claim which definitely would have been believed. So, for example, if one party claims without evidence that another borrowed money from him, the latter person could claim that he never borrowed anything. So he is believed if he makes the more difficult argument that he borrowed the money and repaid it.
Okay. Well, can I present to you an analogy from the Quran?
Please.
So I don't know if you want to put it up for your viewers.
Yeah. Just send me the link via Twitter.
No, because I'm using my phone right now.
Okay.
It's
I can
just
Google
very slow.
Yep.
But if you Google Quran chapter 2, verse 26.
Okay, chapter 2, verse 26. Quran,
so 2:26.
Okay, so surely Allah does not shy away from. Allah is not timid to present an example, that of a mosquito or that which is smaller, and those who have believed know that it is the truth from their Lord. But as for those who disbelieve, they say, what did Allah intend by this as an example? He misleads many thereby and guides many thereby, and he misleads not except the defiantly disobedient.
So I am reading the Abdul Halim translation, and so instead of example there, he has translated that as comparison, so analogy. So if I could just read that back to you with that
Please.
Other translation. God does not shy from drawing comparisons even with something as small as a gnat or larger. The believers know it is the truth from their Lord, but the disbelievers say, "What does God mean by such a comparison or an analogy?" Though through it, he makes many go astray and leads many to the right path. But it is only the rebels he makes go astray, those who break their covenant with God after it has been confirmed, who sever the bonds that God has commanded to be joined, who spread corruption on the earth. These are the losers. Anyways, I always found that verse quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much packed into it, but talk to me in particular about what you find provocative there.
I just don't understand why God is comparing himself to a fly.
Okay, let's go through it sentence by sentence. So could you read the first sentence of that verse?
Actually, you read the first sentence because you've got the other translation. So if you just read that, just the first part.
Okay, so Allah is not timid to present an analogy. And okay,
yeah, but with what? Because it says it gives me
a mosquito
animal,
or what is yeah. Allah is not timid to present an example, that of a mosquito or what is smaller than it. So this is
so that changes the meaning totally. Like my translation, the one that I have, that changes the meaning totally, because example just means that God is presenting like just an example of his creation. Oh, look, there's a mosquito. Oh, look at the sky. Oh, look at Luke Ford. I mean, these are just, examples of God's creation, whereas the translation I have is saying that God is comparing himself to a fly, a gnat.
Yeah, that's why your translation is more apropos. It's more reflective of what we're talking about. Can you read the first sentence of your translation?
God does not shy from drawing comparisons even with something as small as a gnat.
Okay, let's pause there. So here's one thought I have, and I don't know much about Islam, but Christians often have contempt that Jews tend to talk about God more through stories, while Christians primarily, particularly Christian intellectuals, primarily talk about God through dogmatic theology. They develop, elaborate theological systems, comprehensive, dogmatic.
I think we should continue this tomorrow because I have to go. But I would be really interested in continuing this exact topic, and I will tell you why, because I've got a personal reason for why I'm so fixated with the concept of analogy.
Great. I'll do some research, so I'll have something to bring to the table.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I'll speak to you soon then, Luke.
Okay, cheers.
Take care. Goodbye. Bye.
Yeah. So I was just going to make the point that Christians often have contempt for the way that Jews tend to talk about God, because Jews tend to talk about God through sharing stories, while Christians tend to talk about God through the development of systematic theology. And so from the tiny little bit that I know about Islam, it may be that Islam is closer to Judaism in this respect, that Muslims and Muslim clerics may tend to talk about God more through means of a story, an anecdote, as opposed to systematic theology. Boy, I really didn't have much to say, did I, about the role of analogies in Jewish thought, particularly Judaic thought.
Just like the perfectionist, the secure person who asks themselves, can I do this perfectly? In the rare scenario where the answer feels like a yes or pretty close to a yes, they show up with presence and dignity. They're honest about their strengths, and they have no trouble showing other people where they shine. And because they're present and authentic in those moments, they tend to make others feel comfortable, which increases the likelihood of connection with people. But what's interesting is that the exact same thing happens on the other side of this chart. So when the more secure-leaning person asks themselves, "Can I do this perfectly?" and the answer is no, what happens next is they show up with presence and dignity. So they're able to admit what they're struggling with or what they're not great at yet, and they don't need other people to either savior them from that scenario, so to be strong enough on their behalf.
Okay, this is so rich here from Heidi Prieb. I think I want to tackle it when I've got more energy. Meanwhile, let me just play a little bit from Professor Marc Shapiro talking about the Mussar dispute. So you may think, why the heck would there be a Mussar dispute? Mussar is popularly understood to refer to Jewish ethical teachings. How could there be a dispute about that? Well, then he's strongly identifying in-group that has been around for a long time. Any kind of innovation, such as the Mussar movement was an innovation in the 19th century with a particular approach to Jewish ethics, any kind of innovation is going to get a lot of pushback from people who will say that if this innovation was necessary, greater Jews, greater rabbis than you would have come up with it hundreds, even thousands of years ago, and they didn't. Therefore, that which is new is forbidden by the Torah. Right? You have big rabbis saying essentially and literally that which is new is forbidden by the Torah. Also, when there's an innovation, people may feel threatened that it gives credit to someone else when they want the power and the prestige, and they don't want to apportion power and prestige to a competing source. So this is the fourth video in a series on the Mussar dispute by Professor Marc Shapiro. He's a professor of modern Jewish thought.
Slowly, until right like a minute before Shkia, he was right at the entrance, and then he's either it doesn't say if he.
So Shkia refers to the time when the Sabbath begins.
He slipped out, or right in the back when no one would see him. Then he could daven. If you're in the back, you could slip out. So, but he wasn't sure whether this was correct, what he did. So he went to the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish said as follows. I'm going to read it to you. Eineni mevines hashela. I don't understand the question. Haregat seis be'emsa drasha.
So the Chazon Ish was a great rabbi, around the turn of the 20th century.
To leave in the middle of a drasha? His question was, should I have left in the drasha? To daven mincha, he says that you're embarrassing the darshan. So here we see the Chazon Ish saying, if you're caught in this situation where you get in there and the rabbi's speaking, and lo and behold, you're in minchas, you're going to miss mincha. You didn't realize it. You cannot get up and walk out and daven mincha, because that's embarrassing, that people will think that you're showing disrespect to the rabbi. So fascinating, in my opinion. Okay, let's pick up where we are. I want to read you some now of, where is it? Of Rav Chaim Tzvi Hirsch-Broida. After Mearsheimer publishes in Hermaneutics his blistering attack.
So famous rabbis, the Gadolim, right, are often known by their most famous book. I believe that's the case with the Chazon Ish. He was born in 1878. He died in Bnei Brak, Israel, at age 74 in 1953. He did not publish many responsa. That means answers to questions on Jewish law, but he achieved recognition as a leading authority on halakha, Jewish law. He declined to participate in any religious political movements in Israel, and just published a few books. And there's a fictionalized portrait of him by the Yiddish poet and novelist Chaim Grada in the epic three-part Grada novel series, The Yeshiva, where he appears as Rabbi Reb Avraham Shaya Kosovo. And there was a 1,000-page academic biography, the Chazon Ish, published in 2011.
On Mussar, the Rav of Zager, his name was Rav Chaim Tzvi Hirsch-Broida, comes to the defense of a Mearsheimer. And what does he say? Well, he says as follows. And he's the first one to come out to strengthen our Mearsheimer. Soon we're going to see a huge document called Lamanda, signed by all the Gadolim. There's no question that the majority of the Gadolim of the big ones, were in opposition to the Mussar movement. And yet, in the end, by the time after World War I, everyone recognizes that even Rav Borstein of Tavrik, at the end of his life, he said that they were right, the Mussar people. It's like with Rav Soloveitchik. He acknowledges that most of the Gadolim were against Zionism. He says so. But he says that, God himself poskined that this was correct. So sometimes the majority of I know this is for the Haredi people listening. This is maybe, well, not the ones listening to our classes, but in the Haredi world from it, and this is hard to accept that the majority of Rabbanim could be wrong, but we've seen it.
So Haredi Jews are likely to have the least commitment or interest in the modern secular world. They're the group of Jews least likely to go to university. They tend to have the most fervent level of devotion to Jewish tradition and Jewish law.
Again and again, the majority of Gadolim.
So as opposed to modern Orthodox Jews who largely live lives indistinguishable from the lives of secular people around them, except that they take off for Sabbath, Jewish holidays, and they keep kosher. But in the way they dress, the way they comport themselves, will be largely indistinguishable from the secularists around them.
We're against the Hasidim also. So we've seen this again.
So yeah, often the overwhelming majority of the Gadolim will prove to be wrong, right? The overwhelming majority of the Gadolim were opposed to the Mussar movement. The overwhelming majority of the Gadolim were opposed to Zionism. The overwhelming majority of the Gadolim were opposed to the Hasidim. The movement to restrict predators, particularly among rabbis in Jewish life, came from Jewish laity, not from the Gadolim. Right? The biggest innovations in Orthodox Jewish life in America over the last 40 years have primarily come from lay Jews, not from rabbis and not from the Gadolim.
And again, in fact, Ravavi Ravitsky said that he doesn't understand all this business of following the Gadolim. He says on so many of the big issues of the day, Gadolim were wrong. They were wrong on, he goes through the whole list. The difference is that other than Hasidim, and even that maybe they wouldn't agree with. They're not going to agree that they're wrong on Zionism. They're not going to agree that they're wrong on Haskalah. They're not going to agree that they're wrong on any of these issues. But so what does Rav Broida say? He said a very long article, also published in Escalates, and he says that the Slobodka people. And again, he tells us that he's acting on information that he heard. He never went to Slobodka. He never went to Slutsk to visit the students there. But he said that he's told, and he even says, everything I'm saying is in emes nachon hadavar. If what I'm told is correct, but then he blasts them. Well, maybe, again, with all due respect to this great rabbi, maybe he should have confirmed if emes nachon hadavar before he blasts them in such a terrible way. He says that they do minhagim muzarim, strange practices. They spend their day in examining their actions,
So people like to preserve as much power, income, prestige, and money for themselves. And this is equally applicable to great rabbis as it is to plumbers and secretaries and lawyers, right? So you have rabbis who won't move to a particular place because it would mean that they would not be the number one Jew, the number one religious authority in that place, right? Great rabbis are just as likely to yearn for prestige and to have egos as any other group of people.
And in viduim pumbim, public confessions. Now we're going to see there is a place for these confessions, more in the Vardik, however, but not only. But when you read it, when you public, it's not like people are getting up in front of 200 people. It's a different situation. We'll talk about it. They lash themselves. I don't believe that's anyone in Slobodka ever lashed themselves. I don't even know if in Navardik they did. There were people, tzaddikim, over the generations who before Rosh Hashanah would want to do like a sort of malchus, just symbolic. I can show you a video from last Rosh Hashanah. Our colleague in Jerba sent it to the Jews of Jerba line up and they get Malchus. Next time I'll show you maybe. They line up and they give each other little Malchus. He says they fall in the street. They announce Yalla Yovo when it's not Rosh Chodesh in order to embarrass themselves. This is very Navardic like. This isn't, no one in Sabaka was doing this. And he says that this is what I've been told. He also says, and this is more, I guess, rings more true, that they say that only from us, only from the Mussar group, will Torah go forth, because we have Torah v'yira b'yachad. That is true. The Mussar students did think that their approach was the best approach, but why can't they think that? The other people think their approach is the best approach. Now, this sometimes could lead, as we mentioned last class, to negative feelings of others, but that's always the case. You always feel that your group is the better, and doesn't every Hasidic group feel that their rebbe is the best, and every yeshiva feel, everyone, that's not enough of a reason for these sort of attacks. He says that the Mussar students, they have negative feelings about the Gadolim, and they try to lessen them. So they don't really consider them Gadolim. It could be some did that, but that wasn't the case in Sobotka. And look, you might have had some extremists. Now, understand, if you feel that you need to have Mussar in order to be a real Gadol Yisrael, and this rabbi doesn't believe in Mussar, you could have feelings that he's really not such a great figure, but we know Weinberg got smicha from the Rav of Kovno, from Rav of Sobotka, Moshe Donashevsky. He's an anti-Mussar person. We know that they did not have these feelings. Soon we're going to talk about the Yerushalmi, Rav Yosef Sosmanovitz.
Boy, we're all excited to talk about the Yerushalmi, particularly Bernard, who just joined us. All right, here's a little bit more from Marc Shapiro.
At an era, if we had someone who was an apostate who was like a big pro-Israel supporter. Can you imagine half these people, half the Jews in Congress, more than half?
Okay, so this is a good little bit on apostates, people who no longer identify as Jewish.
He says defending the Jews, so much so that on his Jubilee, I think his 70th birthday.
Right, this was a famous Jewish professor who converted to Christianity in 19th century Russia for career reasons.
Unfortunately, but given a very good rabbinic education, and then he became expert in scientific scholarship in Arabic. He had a professoriate in St. Petersburg. He had to get that. He had to convert to get that, and he was a scholar. And he also, although he's an apostate, he always felt connected to the Jewish people. In fact, he famously said about himself, punning on the words of Yom Kippur liturgy, "Ve'achshav shenotzarti ki'ilu notzarti." Yom Kippur means something else. What he said it is, now that I'm notzarti, I became a Christian, it's as if I'm not a Christian. In other words, he only became a Christian. The story is that they asked him, Professor Volson, what convinced you to convert? And he replied, I was convinced it's better to be a professor in St. Petersburg than a Muhammad in Novozhivkov or substitute any other shtetl you want. So he just did it to get ahead. But he continued to remain connected to the Jewish people, and he was very important. He fought against anti-Semitism. He fought against the blood libel. He wrote numerous pieces defending the Jews, so much so that on his Jubilee, I think his 70th birthday, all the rabbis sent him, got together. They want to send him and they did send him a letter thanking him for everything he did to protect the Jewish people. Hakar Satov. But Rav Chaim Brisker refused to sign it. He said, I will not send a letter of thank you to an apostate doing a shumat. And that's Rav Chaim. I don't know. Today, there was a time people would say someone who's intermarried. You can never invite someone who's intermarried to address, a Jewish event. We obviously know today you can't keep to that because in the non-Orthodox world, they're all intermarried, especially politicians. You're going to say you're not going to have a politician event intermarried. So things can change. And if you had an era, if we had someone who was an apostate who was like a big pro-Israel supporter, can you imagine half these people, half the Jews in Congress, more than half, unfortunately. I don't need to go into the details. They are so bad for us. And not just mean Sanders. You got that woman in California. You got a lot of Jews. They're not our friends. So if we had a Mearsheimer who was actually helping Israel, I'm sure that the AIPAC would honor him and the OU might honor him. Who knows? There would be machokas in the OU. We have Aguda, I don't know if they would. But Chlolson and this was really Pekuach Nefesh in the days of pogroms to have something like that. So
okay, Pekuach Nefesh means to save a life.
But here you see him. He's still writing for Hamelitz, even though he's an apostate. So fascinating. Okay, but following that, right before.
So usually strongly identifying groups don't look warmly on people who leave the group. right? Think about how ex-Mormons feel completely shunned by those still practicing the Mormon faith.
For that, the lead article from Mearsheimer. Now, we live in amazing times because before the Hebrew University, before the internet, obviously, and before in Israel, the National Library put all these old Hebrew newspapers online, how would anyone find the Hermaneutics? Harvard, actually, when I was there, had bound copies of Hermaneutics. The only place in America that has bound copies on the stacks you can go get. Everywhere else, I don't even know if in New York they have bound copies. They have microfilms. In fact, I'm pretty sure they don't in most of the places. But suffice, if you live in Cambridge or Boston, you go to Harvard. Otherwise, you're in New York, you go get the microfilm. What do you do anywhere else? Today, within 1 minute, when I saw this article referred to in Dove Katz, I pulled it up within a minute. Any of you can go pull it up. You can see all the Hermaneutics. It's unbelievable that what we have access to today. So I'm going to read it from you from the Mussar, except for one little section, because this is the only example, I think, where Dove Katz, remember we said that Dove Katz in the introduction says, I'm going to give it to you straight. I'm not going to censor Gadolim Yisrael. We need to know the history. However, in this one case, he says, I'm going to copy it. Mila b'mila prat levitoi echad ushnayim sheim haroich harifim bioter. I'm going to leave out one or two expressions that are too sharp. Well, years ago, it would have been hard to find the newspaper. Now I found it. I'll tell you what he left out. Okay, so Mearsheimer, in the opening salvo of the Mussar dispute, what's going on here? So he says, he begins by saying, hold on, the whole thing is copied directly in Mussar. He says, he begins by saying that certainly learning Mussar, Sifrei Mussar, occasionally, often, I should say, is vital, is important. Because, our teva is, we like to, we get haughty and we get, we move apart.
So our teva refers to our inclination. So this is what Wikipedia says. The Mussar movement is a Jewish ethical, educational, and cultural movement that developed in 19th century Lithuania, particularly among Orthodox Lithuanian Jews. The Hebrew term Mussar is adopted from the book of Proverbs, describing moral conduct, instruction, or discipline, educating oneself on how one should act in an appropriate manner. The term was used by the Mussar movement to convey the teachings regarding ethical and spiritual paths. The Mussar movement made significant contributions to Mussar literature and to Jewish ethics, and it has been revived in the 21st century among Jews of all denominations, particularly in the United States. It arose among non-Hasidic Mitnagdim, Orthodox Lithuanian Jews. So Mitnagdim referred to the enemies of the Hasidic Jews. It was a response to the social changes brought about by the Enlightenment and the corresponding Haskalah movement among European Jews. Haskalah refers to the Jewish Enlightenment. So in this period of history, anti-Semitism, assimilation, and poverty, caused severe tension and disappointment among Jews. You had many Jews believing in a false Messiah, Shabtai Zvi. At one point, about a third of the Jews in the world believed that Shabtai Zvi was the Messiah. Religious Jews feared in the 19th century that their way of life was slipping away from them. Observance of traditional Jewish law and custom was on the decline. So whenever you have communities that are not ruled by rabbis, Jews have tended to leave Orthodox Judaism when they've had that opportunity. So many of those who remained loyal to the Orthodox Jewish tradition were losing their emotional connection to its inner meaning and to its ethical core.
From the way we should be. So we definitely need Mussar. So then he says, we have to learn the Mussar of the Kadmonim, the earlier authorities, definitely. I make a Seder, not every day, it's Lifrakim, 100%, so that we can be removed from Gaiva and bad Midos Ras. If you learn the Rambam, you're also learning it in certain sections. And that will put you on the straight path, so you'll be...
So Bernard says that 2 Norwegian ministers have just been fired for plagiarism. So Northern European countries tend to have pretty high ethical standards. Probably there's more social trust and less, obvious cheating in business and on taxes than most other countries. Chat says Zionism is not good for Jews. Hasidim versus Mitnagdim dispute has long ceased to be active or relevant, says the chat.
Properly, you'll behave with God and with people. And therefore, he says, your learning of Torah and your Mussar will go together. He says, however, when you learn Mussar every day, and then he says that if you learn Mussar every day, and you're also learning, let's say, Masechtas Bava Basra, which is different Masechta, you're not going to be pressuring yourself, you're not going to be exerting yourself to understand the Gemara. He assumes. I don't know what the connection is. Why can't you? But this.
So the Gemara refers to the Talmud, and that has traditionally been regarded as the primary object of Jewish study, but for elites, right? Ordinary Jews were not usually expected to learn Talmud.
This is going to get back to what, Mussar, what we think of today is not what it was then. He says you're going to if you're learning everyday Mussar and you're learning Gemara, you're not really exerting yourself. And what are the Mefarshim you have to learn when you do Bava Basra? He says it's the Rashba and Tosos and the Rif and the Rush, and you don't learn them at all. Again, why this assumption that if you're learning Mussar, you're not really learning the Rishonim? I don't know why. He says, but he assumes that these people, they're not going to be serious on Danim because they're spending all this time learning Mussar. How much time are you learning Mussar? An hour a day? That still gives you plenty of time. Maybe he thinks they're learning 3 hours a day. I don't know. There are people who are learning 3 hours a day, but not the average. He says, you need to know the Rishonim to know how to decide halacha, because that's what the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah are based on. And then you need, when you study the Shulchan Aruch, you need to know the Nosei Kelim, he says, the Sma, the Shach, etc. You need to know all of this. And yet, he says, these people in the Mussar yeshivas, you know what they do? He says they were in Bava Basra, and instead of learning the Rishonim and instead of learning the comments of Shulchan Aruch, they were in Ketzosa Choshen. That's what they spend their time on. Okay, where does this idea come from that they only learn Ketzosa Choshen? Ketzosa Choshen was actually instituted in Telz, and then from there went to other yeshivas. We're told by Eliezer Gordon. Okay, so you see, and Telz was a Mussar yeshiva, although we're going to see the big dispute in Telz as well. But this is what can I say? With all due respect to Refaimer, this is a canard. It's not true. We know many Rabbanim who studied in the Mussar yeshivas in Slobodka when it was a Mussar yeshiva before the split, and they learned Rishonim. They didn't just learn the Ketzosa Choshen. But that's already you see here, and this is going to be with all due respect to these, and these are Gadol Yisrael. I mean, I don't touch their fingernails, but in learning. But we're going to see very clearly in the response from Mearsheimer.
So obviously, Gadolim refers to the very height of the great rabbis.
You could be the greatest Gadol in the world, but if you don't have the facts correct, you need to be corrected. If you don't have the correct facts, you need to be told what the truth is. And this idea that in the Mussar yeshivas they just spent their time learning Gemara, Mussar, and Ketzosa Choshen, or whatever other analysis like this, it's not true. But that's what he says. He says they spend their time in Ketzosa Choshen. They spend. They're doing all sorts of mental gymnastics. So it's not just the Mussar's a problem. The whole yeshiva curriculum is a problem for him. And they connect themselves with other students who are likewise, and that leads to basically nonsensical education. And he says, it hardly needs to be said, how far these Mussar students are from Torah truth. Now he's in Schutz with them. All we have to do is walk over to the Mussar yeshiva, the yeshiva that the Ridbaz established, and he could see that it's a falsehood. That they do, maybe they do study Ketzosa Choshen. I'm sure they did, but they did a lot more than that. But this is what he says. And he says we can say about these Talmidim that their Yadayim or Aglayim are not in the...
Okay, so if you're a great rabbi or a great dentist or a great lawyer or a great football player or a great musician, not necessarily going to be more accurate. You're not necessarily going to be more fair. You're not necessarily going to be more informed about things outside your area of expertise.
The base medrash. Basically, they're wasting their time. Because the falsehood has no feet, and therefore they have no feet. They are far from proper learning, and they're also far from proper learning in Mussar books, which they learn every day. Because they do the opposite of what the Mussar books tell them to do. This is going to be a theme we're going to see as well. The idea, you figure the Mussar people, they're supposed to be the highest in terms of personal characteristics, how they relate to people.
Right. There's no necessary connection between what people say and what people do. There's not necessarily any statistically verifiable connection between what people believe and what people study and their behavior. So people who study Mussar are no more likely to be nice and to be ethical and to be upright than people who don't study Mussar, right? There are no guarantees for goodness. The closest that we have to a guarantee for goodness is someone who has normal levels of human connection with family, extended family, friends, and community.
People, and instead the argument is going to be that the Mussar students become big baligaiva, big haughtiness, and think that they're the only ones who have the truth. And they look around looking down on everyone else and looking down on Gadol Yisrael, who are not Mussar people. And there's some truth to this, no question. I'll show you the evidence. You're in a Mussar yeshiva, you look at someone, let's say in another yeshiva who doesn't study Mussar, you look down on him and you look down on his rebbe. Why do you look down on his rebbe? You look down on Rebbe, for instance. Why? because you've been indoctrinated. If you're in a Mussar yeshiva, you've been indoctrinated that unless you learn Mussar, you can't be a complete Jew. So here you see these people don't learn Mussar, and you're also told that even the Rosh Yeshiva need to learn Mussar. So it is going to lead to some of this feeling how to, walk the middle path. That's going to be something the Mussar people are going to have to learn to do. But there is some truth, Mearsheimer saying that it did create a sense that they were an elite. And when you're an elite, you do look down on the others because they don't have the truth. But look, that's, every Hasidic group I think has that, because you're not in my group, you don't know what it means to have the real rebbe and all of it. That's what he says here. And then he goes on. And the Ketzos HaChoshen, returning to Ketzos again, that's Aryeh Leib Heller, the famous Aryeh Leib Heller. If he was alive today, he certainly would not be learning like this because he wouldn't just learn the Ketzos, he'd do what he did. Gemara, Rishonim, and he learned the Shulchan Aruch. And after that, he went into his analysis, and he said he would rebuke them for what they're doing. He says, those Mussar students, that these are like the wily foxes. They're destroying Torah. These are harsh things. Basically, you're talking about not just Talmidei Chachamim, the ones in Slutsk. We're talking about the greatest of the Slobodka students. And this is what you say about them. He says, "Uvali safek einam yodim shum din aburyo." Af Michael Choshen Mishpat. They said they don't even know one halacha properly, even Choshen Mishpat, where supposedly they're spending their whole time studying Bab Basra. I mean, again, this is Motzi Shemra. You can see why the response is going to be so harsh. Because I hate to say it, but what he's saying is false. And you can imagine you're in Slutsk and you're studying there and you read this about yourself. How are you supposed to react? On the one hand, you're supposed to have kavod for Gadolim. On the other hand, when the Gadol is saying something which is false about you, totally improper, and it's a libel, are you allowed to defend yourself? If you defend yourself and you say the truth, and the Gadol, if Mearsheimer was a Gadol, he looks bad because you're embarrassing him probably by showing they didn't have the facts. And that's always been an issue. There'll be many examples in Jewish history where people refuse to respond to Gadolim because they don't want to embarrass the Gadol by pointing out his flaws. So the Rambam says, you can be now loving Ve'am Ovid. But as far as I know, there's no obligation to do that. If someone could be a Gadol, but if he says something about you that's false, you can certainly defend yourself. But he goes on, and he says, he continues, and then he says, he returns. He says, if you study Mussar, that's good to study by yourself and to do it for the sake of God. However, if you do it in public, that is, you do it with a group, where you have a whole seder, where someone bangs on the table and says, for the next hour, now you're all together going to be learning Mussar, he says, and if you do it, you do it to let people know that you're special. You're working on yourself so you can be Yirei Shamayim. That's not something private. It's not something just between you and God. You want the whole world to know about it. Then he says, this is clearly an example of hypocrisy. He says, because the whole point of your learning is just to deceive people so that they think, just like the Tosas mentions, you have these Ramayim, these deceivers who put on tefillin to fool people, to think that they wear it. And he says, he says, these people get together and they do their Mussar thing because they want to show we're the tzaddikim. We're the only ones who have the proper path. Look, it depends how seriously you take the language of the Mussar people. The Mussar people did say you need to do this, and if you don't do this, you're missing an important part of Torah learning. So if you're not in the Mussar school and they said, well, you're missing a part of Torah learning, well, then you might think, well, then they're saying that we're not really learning Torah. But sometimes people say things like that just to build themselves up. They don't actually mean that others are defective. Fine, others are, they're not learning Mussar. It would be better if they did. It depends how seriously you take the language, but he takes it seriously, and he attacks them. He says that, but then he says, but when it comes to the Bachrim, they're not so guilty. Why? They don't know. They're young. Rather, they have been brought to this. They have been, led astray by those who've captured them in their nets. By the Manalim, that is, the people who run the yeshivas, the Alter Sabbatka, that's what he's referring to, and others. These people, the people running the Mussar movement, they're the ones who God will call them to account because they're creating all these problems. What's their intention? Money. They're doing it all to give themselves money. That's what it's all about, he thinks, because they collect a lot of money for their Mussar. They claim when they go out, we have a new style yeshiva. It's a Mussar yeshiva, and we're teaching people things that, giving them an approach to learning that the other yeshivas are not doing. So he's saying,
so when I was early on in my Jewish journey, this notion that ordinary human desires such as ego and thirsting for status and prestige and for power would be just as prevalent among rabbis or as among other groups of people, I would have thought, no way, that can't be true. But then I grew up and realized that rabbis were just as likely to cheat in business or to cheat on their spouses as plumbers.
If I'm saying it's Gazelle Gomor, they're doing this to support themselves economically. That's what they're doing. And he says that they try to show how they're learning in this way to fool people. Now what? And then he has v'chule. What he doesn't include are the words v'tamei v'tamei yikra. That basically we should call them tamei. It's a pasuk from Chumash he's taking. He says hatzavuim shebasutsk, the hypocrites in Slutsk, the asuchos, that they made a contract in matzvuim shebasabotka. So you have the hypocrites here, the phonies in Slutsk, who made a contract with the phonies in Sabotka, and they joined together. Oy lador shekach alta b'yamav.
This guy's giving you a headache. I find him incredibly inspiring, and I'm holding myself back. I'm only playing him at 1.25 speed.
Woe to our generation that this happened, and so I mean, you can't get any harsher than this. I mean, it would be one thing if you'd have a little critique. I don't think this is the proper path. This is a full-blown, nuclear attack, throwing everything out there, attacking not just the actions, but the motives. It's all about pride, not just for the students, but for the Gadolim, the Gadoli Mussar, that it's all about, money. They want to get rich, and they're using this whole idea of Mussar to bring money into it, and the whole thing's a fraud, and the student. There
was a funny YouTube video combined with a song called I Want to Live Like a Hasidic Rebbe, and it was portraying the luxurious lifestyle of many Hasidic Rebbes.
Start learning. I mean, this, as you can imagine, this created a shockwave. The lack of kavod of the Rosh of Shiva and of the Rabbanim and the Talmud.
So kavod refers to respect and honor. Rabbanim refers to plural of rabbis.
And on this page, in Pomos HaMussar, Dov Katz tells the following story, and he tells it in the name of Hayashish, the elderly, Rav David Rakman, who was present at the time as he was a student in the Slutsk Yeshiva. Who's David Rakman? David Rakman is none other than Emmanuel Rakman's father. He's the author of this sefer, Kiryas Chana David. It happens to be a really interesting sefer because he has Sheos Jews and letters with lots of different Gadolim, back and forth. Quite fascinating. And at the bottom, you can see there's a kuntras by his son, Harav Dr. Menachem M. Rakman, who was the rabbi of Shari Tefillah for Brooklyn. When Rakman was young, he also was a Lamdan, and he's able to write Chidushim. So it says he's Yad Yamin, not just a rabbi of Shari Tefillah, Yad Yamino, the right-hand man, he was assistant to the Nasi of Yeshiyas Rebbe Zochanan, who was that? Dr. Belkin. So an interesting sefer, and Rabbi Rakman, he comes to America. There's David Rakman. He was Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiyas Rebbe Zochanan. And then he didn't want to take Parnasa from the yeshiva. So he becomes an insurance agent. He moves to Albany. That's where
So I know my father was willing to sacrifice a great deal to perpetuate his ministry because he didn't want to become an insurance agent. Right? This is the I want to be a rebbe.
Ich will sein a Rebbe. Ich bin geendigt mit dem Gein in Läufen zu Tischen. Sich schockeln noch paar Inches und ich in Dischen. Sich schlugen in Schwitzen zu sehen, wie der Rebbe esst. Genigen mit sich beten bei der Rebbes Gabe, soll mich lassen herangehen, Maske an der Babbe. Der Rebbe ist busy, der Präsident ist du vergesst. Ja, jetzt alle will sitzen mit der Scheine Jiden, beim Misrichwand mit der Bauch zufrieden, wie der Brochen gießt sich, der Geld kim Grimm, mit Scheine Wasser wird, nach halt sich jing. Ja, ins alle will sein, größer Abunem, was gibt neu, wenn du nach auf die Batlunem. Hey, yeah, ich will sein a Rebbe. Hey, 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 ich will sein a Rebbe. Ich will a hooked-up carry, the latest upgrade mit lederne Seats. Custom made up with cherry lights, ist auch jetzt fein mit mir. Ich will a private Shamish mit 3 Gabuem, soll machen Platz, vertraben mich Schiguen, ob sie fehlt aus, wir bringen a Tatz für ein Bier.
Oh yeah.
Ich will a scheine Hose, at least 3 Stocken mit a pur Elevators durch Dachen wocken, in a Porsche kicken, auf mein Backyard, ob alles ist cool.
Oh, that's cool.
Ich will effen en Tischkes und kein Alarm. Ich will a private Mikve, wo es ist eibig warm. Ta Jacuzzi, Mamisch, leben man Indoor-Pool. Ja, ins alle Dillen sitzen mit der Scheine jeden bei der Misse, gewandt mit der Bauch zufrieden. Mit Dachmann, Eizes mit mein Größklick schafft, der Bucher im Kicken auf der Bilder vergabt. Ja, ins alle Dillen sagen, größer Abunnen, was kann neu, wenn du nach auf die Batlune. Hey, yeah, ich will sein a Rebbe. Hey, 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 ich will sein a Rebbe. Ich will kennen fuhren auf a plane, kann Passporten treiben auf den Highway mit der Heavy Escort, mir so kennen fliehen auf at least 100 Mal a Schuh. Ich will a fancy Hose, wie ich will nach umkommen mit seinen Lights im Genimmen, in hinderte Chassidem sollen singen, Borich Abu. Ich will a grobe Pelz, oi wie ich will kalt in a silberne Stecken, oi wie ich will alt in a Closet umgefüllt mit Packages pure Saden. Ich will sitten in aufnehmen für die Joines in Quittler, wenn rieft mir aus, als mit Hindertitlich, und sie hören jenem Stuhl im Bei, es wird mir auch nicht aden.
Okay.
Ja, ins alle Dillfafen auf der Welt, heilen, Keke, machen Geld. Bedacht man, als es in Großklick schafft, der Bucher im Kicken auf der wilde Faga. Ja, ins alle du sagen, größer Abune, was gibt neu, wenn du nach auf die Backlune. Hey, yeah, ich will sein a Rebbe. Hey, hey, ich will sein a Rebbe.
Ich will ein Rebbe, das ist du der Leidig.